Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
From NPR News, this is News and Notes. I'm Farai Chidea. In September 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black students marched through a hostile white crowd. They entered Central High School and the history books. But first they had to deal with Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus. He called in the state's National Guard to stop the integration, even though the Supreme Court had ordered it. Then President Eisenhower stepped in. He ordered the U.S. Army to escort the group known as the Little Rock Nine to their first day of school. They made it inside on September 25th. But the struggle of the Little Rock Nine didn't end once they'd enrolled. Many white students attacked and taunted the black students. One black student was expelled from Central for fighting back. Families of the 9 were chased out of town. Only a third of the original students graduated from Central. I spoke earlier with 3 of the Little Rock Nine. Melba Beals is chair of the Communications Department at Dominican University of California. She's author of the award-winning memoir, Warriors Don't Cry. Terrence Roberts is a professor of psychology at Antioch University in Los Angeles, and Elizabeth Eckford is a probation officer in Little Rock. She's the single black student in that famous photo taken on her first day at Central. You can see that picture if you go to our website, nprnewsandnotes.org. Miss Eckford told me what it was like to be surrounded by the angry crowd.
I was terrified, but what amazes me now is that there are people who call themselves spokesmen for that class year, and they say that those people were from someplace else. They don't know where those people came from, and they must be from out of town. It must have been part of a caravan that came here. But and no attempts to identify people was made by the local press. But since then, some have become known. The girl immediately behind me in that iconic photograph is named Hazel Bryan Massery. As a student, she was Hazel Bryan, and she did attend Central, but she left sometime in October.
And you developed a relationship in adult life. Tell me about that.
I met her in 1997. We were brought together by the photographer who took the original picture. I had talked to her in 1963 on the phone, but at the time I didn't know which of the girls behind me she was. She called to apologize. And in the 2 years we spent together, we spoke to students who came to Little Rock to learn about that part of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, Hazel said she had amnesia about that, and she didn't remember anything. But over a period of time, when she was relaxed, I came to understand that she had contact with those students every Saturday on a local dance show, and that she was part of an organized group that attacked us physically in the school.
It was a situation where even when the National Guard was following you around, they stood back several paces. Professor Roberts, what do you remember about that, those kinds of attacks that Ms. Eckford was talking about?
Well, they were constant, and even with the guards present, it was possible for kids to simply race up behind us and push, shove, kick, spit, or whatever, and then take off running. So they devised many ways. The main goal was to try to force us out.
And it was allowed to continue because the principal said we were to report incidences, but he wouldn't do anything about it if a teacher didn't verify what we said.
Because remember, we called him Smiling Jeff Matthews. He had a perpetual smile. If you told him that you had a colleague lying on the floor being kicked in the stomach, I remember one day reporting that. I think it was Terry or Ernie being kicked in the stomach, and he had the most angelic smile. But he did nothing. He didn't write it down. He didn't say anything. He didn't do anything. He just listened and smiled.
I remember that the superintendent was always urging us not to talk to the press. His was the first book out.
I think until Warriors, my book, Warriors Don't Cry, came out, people didn't realize the extent to which we were tortured daily, like the consistent walking on the back of my heels. When I step off a curb today, the backs of my Achilles hurt because there was a guy trained to do that every day from class to class. My eyes are not what they could be because the guy trained to put acid in the eye. So it was it was a formidable, it was a structured kind of behavior. But of course, I think all three of us do, we think that those guards were instrumental in saving us in terms of those early kinds of acts which were most vicious. I mean, really.
And again, for 25 to 30 years, none of us talked about what it was like inside school. So that some of the students are dismayed. Their concern is how other people view them. Those people who turn their backs and wouldn't even acknowledge what they saw or heard.
It's true.
They want to be congratulated for having tolerated us.
But the reality is, when I wrote the book, for example, I cried for months and months and months. Took 6 to 7 years of therapy to get to the core of the whole thing, because we were so instructed not to let it be known how we really felt, not to cry out, not to ask for help. And those instructions were what really helped to thread us through. But in another way, they quieted a part of us that needed to be heard.
Professor Roberts, did you have, and I'm wondering if this is in any way gendered, it sounds like all of you had to kind of just hide yourselves so that you could survive. Was it any different for the boys than the girls, or was it all part of the same?
No difference at all. We were under those same constraints. I think everybody wanted to sort of put the best face on this thing at the time. Nobody was willing to really confront the major issues that were going on, especially the stuff that we were facing inside the school.
What did you do when you went home? Every day when you left Central High and you went home to your family, did you have to decompress? How did your family treat you? Did they try to comfort you?
I dared not tell my parents because my mother, who I call the Queen of No, was an overly protective parent, and she would not have let me continue. So I never told them. My father was 85 when I showed him the first documentary. My mother died in 1992.
I think that's the same for all of us, that we could talk sometimes to each other, but not even to each other. But we couldn't talk to our parents about the truth, because we knew the result of that. The result of that would be we'd be pulled out of the school, and the tasks that we had set for ourselves, that had been set for us, the agenda set for us. Just like Martin Luther King said, you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it for generations yet unborn.
But do you ever feel that you sacrificed yourselves for a goal that has not yet been realized or that has been thwarted?
There's so much of a difference between now and then. I have difficulty getting students to understand what segregation was like. Yes, there's much, much more to do, but life has changed very much because of the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah. And I feel that what we did, hey, you know what we did? We made him an offer they couldn't refuse. Up to then it would have been, please let me come to your school on our knees. That offer made on that field changed history, and it takes me from the age 65 to look back and see the reality of it. It takes me from an age where I've been a professor now for 10 years teaching it to look back on it and say, you know what? Yes, we have moved forward. We have moved forward enormously.
Well, Professor Roberts, many of you, all of you on some level, have become educators, and when you are working in an educational context, how do you transmit to young students the importance of what happened, and how do you tell them that they should relate to it?
Actually, I talk to them about maintaining very high levels of self-awareness so that they can be very clear about who they are as people. And each one of us is simply a product of the cultural milieu from which we emanate. Many students don't have an awareness, though, of that whole process. So that's step one in a process of really understanding what's needful by way of change. And then we talk about what they can do as individuals and as parts of groups in a society.
Now, the three of you, when you get together with all of the other people who integrated Central High, what kind of, you're part of this ongoing celebration, but what kind of internal conversations are you having with each other about this moment in time, about what you've been through?
We become our real selves. Jefferson Thomas was a very, very funny person, but people at Central didn't see that. Ernest Green was a very sociable person, and that was not shown. We just sort of withdrew within ourselves. And so we become our real selves.
Yeah, Terry Roberts is funny. He whistles a lot, and I was in the first grade with him Okay? And he's not changed enormously from being this very quiet, spiritual guide for us. And so when we come together, we're like a family. We're like brothers and sisters who haven't seen each other. And we fall into almost, from my perspective, some of the same roles we held when we were in school.
Yeah, we truly are a group.
Let me ask you about the Gina 6 case. A lot of people now with the massive protest are comparing this to the civil rights era. In what ways do you think that that comparison is accurate, and in what ways is it not?
Well, I think Gina points out the fact that in this country we have yet to really tackle the basic issue, and that is the underlying roots of racism in this country that give rise to that sort of thing that happened in Gina, that give rise to James Byrd being dragged by a truck in Texas, and et cetera, et cetera. Always you will have this until and unless we confront that basic issue.
I remember that because of the dramatic images that people around the world saw of an ugly reality of Little Rock and America, that is the reason that President Eisenhower reluctantly finally acted, because this was during the time of the Cold War. And so that's when he took federal control of the Arkansas National Guard and sent the paratroopers here, because then he said mob rule could not prevail. But before, his conversation was that this is something up to the states to settle.
Right, a local issue.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
So, Professor Beals, you actually had to leave the area. Your whole family had to leave. Tell me why.
Well, I think all of us left because the Klan at the time was writing, 10,000 down, 10,000 dead, 5 alive. There were hints of all sorts of rude things to our families. Several of the parents have been fired. My mother, I believe, Gloria Ray Colmark's parents, everybody's parents. Terry, I think your parents, everybody's parents suffered. I think Mrs. Eckford did too. Everybody's parents were suffering from this, and the children were being told, don't ever go back to this school again. And so we had no choice but to get out.
There were 4 of us who remained in Little Rock. Had all of us left, a suit that the NACB had pending would have gone moot.
Exactly. So the 4 brave souls remained behind to carry on that suit.
But some families had no choice but to leave.
But probably, too, the closure of the schools prompted some departure.
Mm-hmm.
Because
right.
the public high schools were all closed for the following school year.
That was Terrence Roberts, Melba Beals, and Elizabeth Eckford.
Nigger!
This is News and Notes. I'm Farai Chidea. We continue our discussion with members of the Little Rock Nine. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students marched through a hostile white crowd and integrated the school. I spoke with 3 of the 9. Melba Beals, chair of the communications department at Dominican University of California, Elizabeth Eckford, a probation officer in Little Rock, and Terrence Roberts, a professor of psychology at Antioch University in Los Angeles. I asked Professor Roberts what it was like to look back at the group's struggle half a century later.
Our struggle in 57 was certainly worth it, no question about it.
No question about it.
We were responding to the needs of the time. And I think young people today have the same responsibility to respond to the needs of the time. Whether they will do that or not, or how they will do that, is up to them.
Little Rock was different and significant and worth it because it set a new tone. As I said before, it changed the playing field. It was a notice to all the states across the South. Integrate, follow the law, or there are options we can take. And until that time, there have been no options. And so what we did was speed it up. The contribution was that we set a different tone. We said, okay, move ahead now. It's time to go this way. We are not going to stand outside your school pleading with you until you say welcome one day, because it's not going to happen. We're going to possess, we're going to take, we're going to claim our own equality.
What about the whole question of where the civil rights movement, or some people call it a human rights movement, goes from here? We've talked a little bit about recent Supreme Court decisions about desegregation, talked a little bit about the changing nature of the population of the school system. But if you are a parent, a teacher, a community leader who looks at the schools and says, we haven't come far enough, how do you push forward an agenda of equality?
Across the country, there's a challenge of how do you provide an equitable education for all students, regardless of socioeconomic status of the community they live in. And teachers are challenged to intentionally teach all students. But, that's one thing that the No Child Left Behind does, is it challenges and makes accountable school systems for the end result of all students.
Well, the other thing that's the goal. I'm not quite sure it is.
No, I would agree with Terry. I think that across the country, every parent has to look at what their child is getting. And part of what the Supreme Court is saying by taking some of the stiffness and the snow out of Brown is that, okay, we may not need to go that way, but we, as people of consciousness and color, must look at it and say, that is the way we're going. We're going to educate. It was very interesting when I started to turn around and say, okay, I'm going to be a professor, I'm going to teach. It was actually Terry who helped to mentor me to move ahead and do that.
Before we let you go, if you had to put a message into a time capsule, and I'm sure that you've had this chance in some ways with your own writings and with the speaking that you do, if you had to put something into a time capsule for a class at Central High, say 100 years from now, telling them how to treat each other fairly, with justice, with compassion, what kind of message would you leave? Ms. Eckford, let me start with you.
Well, I would tell them that they themselves can be very, very powerful. They generally don't know that, but they can be very, very powerful. And I point to an example for me when I would go all day long being set apart, being alone, and the people who weren't hitting me were turning their backs. But in the last class of the day, this shy person felt comfortable in a speech class because of what was happening there for me. There were people who reached out to me daily, and that was the only time that happened.
Professor Roberts?
Well, I would share some wisdom that came my way when I was in first grade. My first grade teacher told all of us in that class that we had to take executive responsibility for our own learning. Mm-hmm. And that learning was important because with learning, you multiplied the available options in your life. Without learning, you're forced to use the same options over and over. So lifelong learning would be my message.
And Professor Beals?
Namaste is how I end my book. The God in me sees the God in you. The only way we will ever make it is if we all understand that if one of us is enslaved, if one Iraqi is enslaved and not recognized and not being seen for himself, we are all enslaved. And so the only answer is to love and respect yourself and to love and respect your colleagues, because seeing equal is being equal. And only when you understand the value of everybody around you do we get the equality that we're going for. And certainly one way of perpetuating that is what Dr. Roberts said. You've got to be committed to enhancing your own self, empowering yourself to claim your equality. It isn't given to you. It's a claim.
Professor Beals, Ms. Eckford, Professor Roberts, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That was Melba Beals, chair of the Communications Department at Dominican University of California. Also, Elizabeth Eckford, a probation officer in Little Rock, and Terrence Roberts, a professor of psychology at Antioch University in Los Angeles. They were all part of the Little Rock Nine. That group of black students integrated Little Rock Central High School half a century ago this week. To see historic pictures of the Little Rock Nine and to discuss their legacy, go to our blog, nprnewsandviews.org.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, April 19th, 2013. So I have been told. The audio clip that we played at the beginning of the program, that is a two-part segment at NPR. They actually have a trough of material on the Central High, quote-unquote, integration. They had a big to-do for the 50th anniversary. They even had material dating back to 96 when it was the 40th anniversary. But they even talked to some of the white 101st Division National Guard that went into after Eisenhower sent the troops in to protect and serve justice. They even have some of those white people on interviews. They obviously have several clips with Elizabeth Eckford and some of the other members of the Little Rock Nine. Lots of material. You can just go to NPR and do a search for Little Rock Nine, and it should pop up. You can put in the individuals' names, and that'll pop up there as well. David Margolick did an interview there about his book. I was going to play a clip from that, but this I thought was a lot juicier. Anywho, before we get to the third installment of Elizabeth and Hazel, I guess they had a shootout of some sort in Boston around the bombing that took place earlier this week at the marathon. The only quick thing that I wanted to point out, the governor in Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, racist suspect, apparently he lifted an order that confined about 1 million residents to their houses. And I just thought that, to me, is another blatant illustration of racism, white supremacy. I would just tell folks to think in this area of the world, if you are aware of a black person who could legally enforce keeping 1 million people, white and non-white, in their houses for a period of time, and with a threat of punishment if you don't do so, can you think of, a non-white person who could make that happen? Because apparently Governor Deval Patrick has that power. We will get right to it. Third installment, David Margolick, racist suspect, Elizabeth and Hazel, 2 women of Little Rock. Before we start the audio segments from this week, this is actually, I'm digging from that trough of NPR because I was just stunned that they had so much material. This is actually picking up right where we left off. I was going to kind of rewind and make sure everybody remembers where we ended last week at, but this short clip will do so. So the clip will end where we left off at last week, and then the audio clip for this week for Elizabeth and Hazel will start at the conclusion. Context of White Supremacy.
In September 1957, Louis Armstrong canceled his tour of the Soviet Union because of events in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students attempted to integrate Central High School there. Governor Orville Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to bar the door. Louis Armstrong decided he didn't want to make a tour of the Soviet Union, sponsored by the U.S. State Department. Larry Lubinow was a reporter at the time, and he broke the story. He joins us now from member station KUT in Austin. Mr. Lubinow, thanks very much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this.
You were a journalism student then, weren't you?
Yes, I was a senior in college, moonlighting at the paper.
You were working part-time for the Grand Forks Herald, right?
Yes, I was.
And how'd you happen to talk to Louis Armstrong?
I got a call from the editor that they wanted a reporter to go down to talk to Louis about music. I asked one question about music, and then I asked Louis if he knew that he was staying in the hometown of Judge Ronald Davey, who made the decision at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on Little Rock, and he said he didn't. Then he went off.
He had some strong words for people in the U.S. government then, didn't he?
Well, even stronger than that which was printed. He used expletives when he talked about Ike and John Foster Dulles and also Orville Faubus.
What did he call Governor Faubus?
Well, I can't repeat it. Not on NPR.
I thought it was just an ignorant plowboy. You can repeat that.
Well, that's what we went with, and Louis said, fine, go with it.
Oh, so let me get this straight. He didn't actually say ignorant plowboy. He said something else, and you said, let's see if we can agree on an epithet here?
He said he's a no-good mother.
And he probably didn't mean mother. I see what you mean.
No,
and so what did you say, Mr. Armstrong, give me something I can put in the paper?
Yeah, I sure did.
What did Louis Armstrong say in the interview about not going to the Soviet Union? Do you recall?
Well, he said that as far as he was concerned, Ike and the government could go to hell. And he sang his version of the Star Spangled Banner to me with very dirty lyrics. Oh, say, can you mothers MFC by the MF Early Light? He was very mad.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard that version.
Yeah.
What happened to your story? Did you know you had a scoop?
I broke the story, and I got all of $3.50 for the story, I think. Missed the concert. And because I was busy putting out the story.
Now, President Eisenhower eventually did order the 101st Airborne into Little Rock to integrate the schools.
Yes, he did, and some people think that it was because of Louis' words.
Well, Mr. Lubinow, awfully nice talking to you.
My pleasure, Scott.
Speaking with us from Austin, Texas, Larry Lubinow.
Chapter 15. American diplomacy faced greater problems than the cancellation of Armstrong's tour. The U.S. Information Agency, then showing Edward Steichen's famous photographic exhibit The Family of Man around the world, now had to juxtapose its inspirational images of brotherhood against the pictures coming out of Arkansas. One USIA report complained that photographs from Little Rock were particularly damaging to U.S. prestige. The agency scoured its archives for pictures of blacks and whites in harmony to offset them. The State Department created talking points to overcome adverse reaction to Little Rock incident for all field missions in sub-Saharan Africa, but conceded that the damage done by sensational newspaper accounts and photographs cannot be repaired overnight. Dulles lamented that Little Rock was harming America more than the suppression of the revolt in Hungary the previous year had hurt the Soviets. American tourists were not immune. Everywhere Americans have gone in recent years, they have gotten Little Rock thrown in their faces, W.E.B. Du Bois remarked in 1959. Faubus insisted that he was both maintaining order and reflecting the wishes of his constituents. Forced integration, he said, was bad for both races. Mike Wallace, hosting an interview program for ABC News, caught up with the governor only a few days after Elizabeth's walk. Probably every newspaper in the country has published a picture of the 15-year-old Negro girl walking to and from school with a crowd of white students behind her, sneering, snarling, and probably even cursing, Wallace said. How did the governor feel about that? He hated violence and enmity, Faubus replied. His childhood hero, after all, was Lincoln, who had counseled malice toward none. But Elizabeth, he suggested, was a tool of outside agitators. It was a point Faubus repeated and elaborated upon over the years. Masters at garnering sympathetic publicity, he contended, the Communists had meticulously choreographed the whole thing. Where Elizabeth had gotten off the bus, how far she had walked, how often and where she approached the guardsman, and the path she took afterward, where, of course, dozens of cameramen, photographers, reporters, and observers just happened to be. The planning, charged Faubus, began with the selection of Elizabeth herself. They picked one of the sweetest, most appealing, innocent-appearing Negro girls to take the key role, he said. All of this was very carefully worked out and planned just like you'd work out a military maneuver. As we say in the Army, they'd G2'd the place. That is, had done sophisticated intelligence work. I have to marvel at the way they handled it. The Eckford girl followed these directions to the letter, and the success in reaping publicity was phenomenal, Faubus later wrote. The lone, shy, well-mannered Negro girl, notebook in hand, turned back by lines of armed guardsmen and ringed, temporarily at least, by heckling whites. What more appealing picture could be portrayed to gain the desired sympathetic publicity? The planners of this publicity stunt chose the students well. He never said whether Hazel and her histrionics were also part of the planning. She'd had all this prior instruction to come to a certain point and then walk down this way and all the cameras grinding, Faubus recalled at another point. And then, who should be awaiting Elizabeth at the finish line but one of her communist puppet masters, Grace Lorch. Daisy Bates, too, had communist ties, Faubus claimed, and may well have been in cahoots with the party apparat. The court challenge to the desegregation plan dragged on. On September 20th, Elizabeth testified briefly before Judge Davies, talking so quietly that he'd had to urge her to speak up. Again, Davies ordered Faubus to stop interfering and to admit the black children. Another date for implementing the plan was set, September 23rd. With the National Guard having been withdrawn, only the Little Rock police would be there to protect the black students. Once more, Daisy Bates notified the families to bring the children to her home. By now, the Eckfords had a telephone. The novelty quickly wore off as the hate calls started coming. But dreading a conversation with them, how could she ask Elizabeth's mother to send her daughter out again? Bates put off contacting them. When she finally did call, Bertie Eckford demurred. She had to ask Elizabeth. When she returned to the phone, Elizabeth's mother had but one question. What time should Elizabeth show up? The next morning, Elizabeth was among the first to arrive. This time, though, she would not have to go to school alone. The 9 reached Central, where more than 1,000 protesters had already gathered. They came from all over Arkansas. Even some of Oscar Eckford's co-workers at the Missouri Pacific were on hand. The Little Rock police, thoroughly overmatched and ambivalent at best about their mission, managed to slip the black students, accompanied by Daisy Bates, Lee Lorch, and a couple of others, in ignobly through a side door, partly because the simultaneous arrival of 3 black newsmen in front of Central momentarily distracted the mob. The 3 were quickly set upon. Bearing the brunt was L. Alex Wilson, the editor of the Memphis Tri-State Defender. Despite pleas from his colleagues, Wilson refused to flee, even after being hit over the head by a brick. Only one policeman moved, ineffectually, to help him. From the front steps of the school, Central's football coach, Wilson Matthews, looked on with amazement. "I never thought I'd see it," he remarked. "They're killing those niggers." This moment, too, Will Counts captured. Little Rock, declared Alistair Cook after the latest pictures appeared, had become as universally infamous as Rome at the height of its decadence. A Marine during World War II and later a correspondent in Korea, Wilson insisted on keeping his hat throughout the assault. That's what a gentleman did. Besides, he didn't want his attackers to know how badly he'd been hurt. "I fought for my country in the war, and I'm not running from you," Wilson, the father of a 5-month-old daughter, told them. Later, he offered another reason he'd stood his ground. Elizabeth Eckford hadn't run, he noted. How, then, could he? He soon developed Parkinson's disease, presumably because of his beating, and within 3 years he died, age 51. Though the assailants were readily identifiable from Counts's photographs, no one was ever prosecuted, nor even, it appears, seriously investigated for the assault. Word quickly spread among the demonstrators that the black students had entered Central. There were calls to go inside and drag them out. Some of the white students in the building tried to flee. Hazel's pal, Sammy Dean, jumped out a second-story window, the first of her many flamboyant and highly publicized protests. For the next 3 hours, a crowd of seething whites hovered outside the place, repeatedly trying to break through the fragile police lines. Meanwhile, the 9 went to their first classes. Someone photographed Elizabeth in one of them. The next day's Democrat ran the picture on its front page. But school and police officials quickly concluded the situation was too volatile to let the black children remain. It was scary enough with them in the building. What would happen at the end of the day when they had to go home? So, after a couple of hours, officials decided to pull the students out. They were brought to the principal's office, then led to the basement, where they were ordered to lie down on the floors of 2 unmarked police cars and covered with blankets as the cruisers sped off. Elizabeth always thought the officers saved their lives that day. Once again, Little Rock's experiment with desegregation was suspended. That afternoon, Bates told reporters that the children wouldn't return to Central until the President of the United States supplied some protection. That night, policemen patrolled outside the homes of each of the 9, as well as the Bates home. An anonymous caller told Daisy Bates that someone connected to the desegregation campaign had just been killed, that she was responsible, and that more deaths would follow that night. "My heart stood still," she later wrote. "I thought of Mr. Eckford, the father of Elizabeth, returning home from his night employment. I could envision him being shot down and his warm blood running in the street." The next day, September 24th, the black students stayed away from Central. Had they shown up, Bates feared, some of them might have been killed. Little Rock was a frightened city that evening, Louis Cassels later recalled in the New York World Telegram. It half expected a race riot to break out at any moment. Along West 9th Street, where memories of the 1927 lynching remained vivid, the cafes and pool halls were deserted. In black neighborhoods, the shades were drawn. The deteriorating situation finally prompted Eisenhower to act. Elizabeth and the others were at the Bates home when he announced on television that he was sending the 101st Airborne Division into Little Rock. She, too, saw what became of another iconic photograph from that drama, the procession of jeeps and other military vehicles, their headlights piercing the Indian summer steaminess, crossing the river into Little Rock, a billboard, "Who will build Arkansas if her own people do not?" illuminated in the background. Unlike the kids in the National Guard, the screaming eagles of the 101st were the real deal. Their khaki-clad rigidity was in marked contrast to the exquisite boredom displayed by the guardsmen, according to the Central High School Tiger. By nightfall, 319 members of the 101st encircled the school, and while Bates expected a day's delay, their commander insisted that the black children come to Central the next morning. After more frantic phone calls, the 9 once again gathered at the Bates home. They said a prayer, then hopped into 2 Army station wagons, this time sitting upright rather than lying hidden under blankets on the floor. Then, with soldiers sporting helmets, rifles, and combat gear riding shotgun at either end of the motorcade, they arrived at Central. Faced with this show of force, the mob suddenly lost its ardor. Escorted by 22 soldiers, first up the stately steps and then through the monumental wooden doors, Elizabeth and the others entered. Inside, each was assigned a personal escort, who took her to class, waited outside, then took her to the next. Never before had the black students been treated so respectfully, and by white people at that. The soldiers actually called the black girls ma'am. In various documentaries, it is at this point that the music usually swells and the credits roll. The story is triumphantly over. "If you decide to walk into the schools with the little colored kids, take me along, Daddy," Louis Armstrong wired Eisenhower. A cartoon appearing in the German paper Tagesspiegel showed Eisenhower in a tank, talking to an Elizabeth surrogate. "Come, little girl," he beckons. "I'll take you to school." Chapter 16. The initial reports from inside were encouraging. They, the white students, were so wonderful, Melba Patillo told one reporter. "They treated us so good. Nothing I can say describes just how happy I am." A picture taken during the morning of the first day of classes, in the midst of a fire drill that was actually a bomb scare, showed Elizabeth chatting, apparently casually and comfortably, with 2 white girls from her history class. In fact, anticipating problems when the soldiers were not around, Elizabeth was asking one of them, Priscilla Thompson, to describe the layout of the lunchroom and the gymnasium for her. The photograph ran throughout the country the following day, counteracting a bit the pictures from 3 weeks earlier, and corroborating what the black students themselves said. "The teachers are very nice. Nothing went wrong. There were no catcalls. I especially enjoyed my history and English classes," Elizabeth reported after that first day. "Everything will be all right, for the majority of the white students themselves are all right." "This nervous town has simmered down to a slow beat," Bill Patton wrote a few days into the new era in the New York Age. 9 Negro boys and girls have been attending classes at Central High School for a week, and the walls haven't crumbled, nor has the color rubbed off on any of the students they chanced to meet. Soon, though, there were disquieting signs. On October 1st, while walking down the hall, Elizabeth was struck from behind with a pencil. In gym class the next day, someone threw a rock at her. When a soldier asked who, the white students just laughed. All this bore watching, but suddenly there was something else for the world to see. On October 4th, the day Little Rock's papers described Central students hanging a black body in effigy, up went Sputnik. something that humbled and terrified most Americans, left Mrs. Huckabee, for one, feeling relieved. "We'll be glad to take second billing for a while," she wrote her brother. "Not so fast," the Soviets seemed to reply. On October 9th, while stating the times the first man-made satellite would be visible from the world's largest cities, Radio Moscow amended its list, announcing that it would pass over Little Rock and Central High School at 9:36 the following night. Standing on the very street where Elizabeth had just felt the grim present, one could now gaze skyward and see the future. By the time people stopped looking up and resumed looking across, things had changed dramatically at Central, for the worse. While hardly enthusiastic about integration, most students were willing to tolerate it. But lurking in the shadows was a hard core, estimates ranged from 50 to 200, of sadistic segregationists, either freelance, precocious bigots, or pawns of grown-up diehards, bent on wreaking as much havoc as they could. The question was whether anyone, administrators and teachers, the soldiers, the police, the community, their fellow students, would rein them in. Under intense political pressure, Eisenhower withdrew the paratroopers as quickly as he could, sending them back in only whenever conditions worsened. For the most part, the protection of the black students fell to the same Arkansas National Guardsmen who had previously kept them out. It was a job for which they had little training or inclination. Many hated desegregation as ardently as the protesters. Some were kids, still in or barely out of high school themselves, who could occasionally be spotted walking arm in arm with Central girls. Whenever trouble occurred, they seemed to be somewhere else, or looking the other way. So, too, were most school officials. Some of them, notably Central's principal, Jess Matthews, were lukewarm themselves about having the black students around, and resented enforcing what meddlesome outsiders had foisted on them. Matthews had done nothing to prepare students or teachers for what was happening, let alone inspire them to rise to the occasion. In fact, he stood in the way. During the summer, some members of the incoming student council had arranged a formal welcome for the black pioneers, thereby signaling to one and all that whatever their reservations about integration might be, they would uphold the law. The date was set, Friday, August 30th, and invitations were printed. But after all the turmoil in the days before, the Segregationist Mothers League had been formed, the desegregation plan had been challenged in court, the superintendent's daughter had been threatened. Matthews nixed the idea at the last moment. Later attempts to revive the plan were also thwarted. Similarly, nothing had come of the principal's notion, one he'd broached during practice one day, of having the football players help maintain order around the school once desegregation started. The black students would be on their own. None of Central's student leaders would ever get to know any of them or feel much of a stake in their well-being. Like everyone else, the president of the student body, Ralph Brody, had seen the picture of Elizabeth and Hazel. It embarrassed him, of course, but he hadn't thought of it for more than a minute or two. A new school year was beginning. There were students to motivate, teams to launch, and, as it turned out, aggressive northern reporters with agendas to talk to. When Mike Wallace, then a young television reporter as well as a columnist for the New York Post, telephoned Central on September 3rd in search of a big man on campus to interview, it was Brody, a defensive back and backup quarterback in football, a letterman in basketball, and a 3-time state track champion in high and low hurdles and relays, in addition to governor at Arkansas Boys State, who quite naturally was summoned. As Mrs. Huckabee hovered over him, Brody, 17 years old, sat behind the principal's desk, fielding the reporter's inquiries. 3 questions or so in, he distinctly felt that Wallace was setting him up, trying to coax him into saying something stupid, and thereby confirming for his citified readers that all Arkansians were rednecks. Was he alarmed by the situation? No. How long would it last? It's up to Governor Faubus. Did he think the Negro students could come to school tomorrow? Sir, it's the law. We are going to have to face it sometime. Would you mind sitting next to a Negro? No. Would there be much resistance to integration? I don't believe there'll be any at all. Do you have Negro friends? No, sir. Had he done any soul-searching about segregation? Not particularly. Would it make a difference to him to see a white girl dating a Negro boy? I believe it would. Why? I was just brought up that way. Do you think Negroes are equal to whites? That is a matter of opinion. What's yours? If they have had the same benefits and advantages, I think they're equally as smart. Should Southerners live by the law of the land? I don't see why we shouldn't. We've been living under it all our lives. It lasted just a few minutes, and after Wallace had hung up, Brodie turned to Mrs. Huckabee. "That man was trying to make us all look bad," he cried out. To Brodie, Wallace was like many of the reporters who had descended on Central. At night, he'd watch their reports on television, and what they described scarcely resembled what he'd seen at the school earlier in the day. After his interview with Wallace was reprinted in the Gazette, out-of-town reporters began badgering Brodie for quotes, all, he was convinced, to buttress their biased portrayals. It got so bad that he and his father had to ask the local prosecutor to keep the press away from him, and for as long as Brodie needed it, the prosecutor did. Brodie himself did the rest. 20 years passed before he granted another interview. Barely into the new school year, then, Brodie already believed Central's whites had not been allowed to show their good character, and that the Northern press wouldn't have believed them even if they had. They were feelings that would last a lifetime. Chapter 17. Elizabeth's homeroom teacher, Miss Poindexter, was a disciplinarian who kept things largely under control, making some boys take off their Confederate caps and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Nothing bad happened to Elizabeth there. At least at first, some white classmates befriended her and the other black students. But in the official vacuum, the segregationists quickly came to set the tone, intimidating all the others — in the South, few labels were more toxic than nigger lover — into silence. Elizabeth was surprised by how quickly the tolerant kids gave up. Within a few weeks, most of the goodwill had evaporated. She'd believed that as people got to know her, and she could show them that she was a good Negro, she'd be accepted, but that was not the case. As time passed, her every day inside Central came to resemble that first day outside it. It was worse, really, because now no one was taking pictures. Already scattered, only rarely were two of them in a class together, the black students became almost entirely isolated. Elizabeth sat by herself in her classes, always at the rear, often with no one nearby. Even the few white children she'd known previously now steered clear of her. "Please don't let them know you know me," their eyes seemed to plead. Only during her last class of the day, speech, were there any friendly faces. To be precise, there were two, belonging to Ken Reinhardt and Ann Williams, who felt free to be nice only because their teacher, Miss McGalen, was both sympathetic and strict. Decades later, Williams still recalled how isolated Elizabeth was that first day. No one deserved to be that lonely. Miss McGalen remembered Elizabeth as a very fragile little girl, looking like I could blow her away with one puff. It became the only class in which she sat in the front row, rather than off by herself somewhere in the back. That small bit of friendliness and security helped Elizabeth to blossom a bit. It was in front of this class, for instance, that she first appeared on a stage, delivering Portia's courtroom speech from The Merchant of Venice in Central's massive auditorium. Williams, Reinhardt, and the handful of students like them suffered for their solicitude. A few other students did speak to Elizabeth, but only to hear what it sounded like. Some tried to do the right thing. Ted Poston of the New York Post wrote of a visit paid by 7 white school children along with their pastor to Daisy Bates. The occasion was marred for Poston when he answered the phone. "Is Mrs. Eckford back from New York?" the caller, it sounded like a teenage boy, asked. Elizabeth's mother had never left Little Rock, Poston replied. "Don't give me that shit, you black babooning son of a bitch," the boy went on. "You know you sent her back up there to visit her family, just like you brought her and that little Elizabeth ape down from there to stink up our schools." Calls like this led Elizabeth's mother to forbid her from answering the Eckfords' phone. Anyone doubting that the South could ever be redeemed, the columnist Max Lerner wrote, could learn from the quiet confidence of Elizabeth Eckford, who will never waver in her purpose, no matter what hurts she must suffer, and whatever psychic price she must pay. They were pretty words, but it wasn't really so. Less than a week into school, Elizabeth came into Mrs. Huckabee's office, red-eyed, her handkerchief in a damp ball in her hands. So bad was the harassment that she wanted to go home early. Appealing to Elizabeth's courage, Mrs. Huckabee persuaded her to stay. A week later, Paris Match ran another picture of Elizabeth with her white classmates during that fire drill, only in this one she seemed very much alone. "Elizabeth Ann Eckford is in school, but she is in quarantine," the caption declared. Mrs. Huckabee asked some of Elizabeth's teachers to look out for her, though she estimated that 1/3 of them considered desegregation just terrible. One was Elizabeth's history teacher, Miss Emily Penton. Ever since the 4th grade, when her mother gave her a well-worn world history textbook with tales of the Fertile Crescent and the Ottoman Empire, history had been Elizabeth's favorite subject. She savored the black history she'd learned at Dunbar, even though it was rudimentary, non-controversial stuff, more Booker T. Washington than Frederick Douglass, more George Washington Carver and his peanuts than slave rebellions, abolitionists, and Buffalo Soldiers. Every year she relished Negro History Week, when Ebony highlighted something from the African-American past. With Miss Penton, a schoolmarm with a pince-nez who had already been teaching Little Rock's high school students for 4 years when Central opened, the lessons were very different, something out of A Birth of a Nation. In them, slavery had civilized blacks. The Ku Klux Klan defended white womanhood. Lincoln freed the slaves strictly for tactical reasons. The black office holders during Reconstruction were all ignoramuses and buffoons. As shocking as this was to Elizabeth, more shocking was that no one ever objected, even though many of her classmates, the superintendent's daughter among them, came from prominent families. Miss Penton did call on Elizabeth occasionally, but when there was money to collect, say for the Weekly Reader, she refused to touch her, insisting that Elizabeth put the coins down on her desk. When Elizabeth complained about her to the principal, she was informed that Miss Penton was a graduate of the University of Chicago and a pillar of the community. Chapter 18. When Jackie Robinson broke into Major League Baseball, a decade before blacks entered Central High School, he was spiked on the base paths, shunned by some of his own teammates, taunted mercilessly from the opposing dugout. Yet he had managed to maintain his composure so admirably that when the black students were told how to carry themselves inside Central, his example was invariably cited. But when the recently retired Robinson spoke to 7 of the 9 by phone on October 18th, he insisted that he was in awe of them. He had had the backing of the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the president of the National League, and the commissioner of baseball. The 9, by contrast, had been largely on their own. "I think it makes my job look like nothing, what I had to go through," he told them. Elizabeth missed the call, having been home with the flu, but Mrs. Huckabee's disciplinary files give some sense of what she encountered that fall when she was in school, and it was a litany Jackie Robinson would have recognized. October 28th, Elizabeth shoved in hall. November 20th, Elizabeth jostled in gym. November 21st, Elizabeth hit with paperclip. In fact, most incidents went unrecorded, especially once Elizabeth, convinced it did no good, stopped reporting them. The guardsmen who had taken over for the paratroopers were instructed to intervene only in the most egregious cases. Once, after she was body-slammed, timid Elizabeth actually grabbed her assailant. "Tell me you didn't see that," she shouted at the nearby soldier. He ordered her to let the girl go. The guardsmen's ranks gradually thinned, but as meager as their protection was, the head of the segregationist Mothers League cautioned that there would be bloodshed were they taken away. Self-serving scare tactics, perhaps, but the mildly pro-integration Gazette warned of the same thing. In late October, the parents of the 9 met with Blossom to complain about the situation. Meanwhile, some of the black students devised ways to cope with, or at least to cushion, the pain, laughing off their tormentors, as did Minnie Jean Brown and Jefferson Thomas, gritting their teeth, like Carlotta Walls, verbally sparring with harassers, or silently reciting poetry, like Terence Roberts. Ernest Green's maturity and stature seemed to help him endure, and with her heart problems, Thelma Mothershed appeared to be off-limits. Killing one of the 9 was surely bad strategically. Elizabeth had no such defenses. Indeed, maybe her fame made her more of a target. She seemed to take and absorb every blow. Fearful of rallying those who wanted to scuttle the experiment, Bates and the NAACP played down the difficulties inside the school. On November 25th, the black students gathered at the Bates home for an early Thanksgiving. More than the turkey was stuffed that day. The small dining room was crammed with reporters and photographers invited to look on as the Little Rock 9 feigned normality and thanks. The evening's theme wasn't just gratitude, but patriotism. Each of the black students had to explain why, in spite of everything, he or she preferred life in America to the Soviet Union. Elizabeth Eckford started a statement and then dropped the microphone, apparently distraught, reported the Democrat. "That's all," she said, and left. December 10th. Elizabeth kicked in gym class. Tells Mrs. Huckabee such kicks happened all the time. December 18th. Elizabeth punched and hit by books. Beyond the individual indignities, having a dead fly tossed onto your cafeteria tray, say, or hearing someone mutter, "Remember the till, boy." There were group insults, too, like seeing "nigger go home" soaped onto the bathroom mirrors. Far from penalizing the worst offenders, Matthews tried appeasing and even empathizing with them. In an embittered, unpublished memoir, Central's vice principal, J.O. Powell, himself a graduate of the school, described a typical Matthews dressing down. "You're not going to solve this thing by punching niggers," he would tell the latest miscreant. "This thing is bigger than you and me and Congress and the governor and everybody else, and it's not going to be solved any time soon. We don't like it any more than you do, but it's here. Now you just quit causing trouble and stay out of the vice principal's office, or I'm going to have to do something about you. You start thinking about your education and quit worrying about integration and niggers." To the black students, Matthews was someone who did nothing, though always with a smile. Grinning Chicken Jess, they called him. Despite the brave public front, Daisy Bates was candid with her colleagues. "Conditions are yet pretty rough in the school," she wrote Roy Wilkins on December 17th. Rough enough, in fact, for her to ask that FBI agents be sent there. That, it turned out, was also the date of what soon became a celebrated episode in the school cafeteria. Not surprisingly, it involved Minnie Jean Brown. Confident and combative, she, more than the 8 other black students, acted as if she belonged at Central, which only roused the troublemakers more. After some boys attempted to trip her while she carried a tray of food to her table, she dumped a bowl of chili on one of them. The black women working the lunch line broke out in applause, but Minnie Jean was summarily suspended. Elizabeth happily yielded the distinction of being the most famous of the 9. What mattered far more to her was that Minnie Jean was her closest friend at Central, someone who understood and protected her. And now she'd be gone a while. Chapter 19. One Sunday morning in November, Harold Isaacs of MIT was picked up at his hotel in Little Rock by a World War II buddy of his named Frank Newell. Isaacs, who had chronicled the fighting in China, India, and Southeast Asia in the 1930s and 1940s, was now covering another battle, one which to him represented the front line in the Cold War. Imagine, marveled Newell, who now sold insurance, a foreign correspondent in Little Rock. How, Isaacs asked him, did all the attention make him feel? Embarrassed, Newell said, embarrassed and ashamed. Newell used most of the key words, appalling, terrible, shameful, humiliating, Isaacs later wrote. For the next 8 days he canvassed the local gentry. Years later, his remarkable unpublished notes of those self-lacerating interviews read more like something out of Spoon River than Little Rock. Newell took him to the Little Rock Club, the favorite and extremely segregated watering hole of the squirearchy at 4th and Center, where even on a Sunday morning folks were drowning their shame in drink. Though they had little idea how wretched life was becoming for the Little Rock Nine, the newspapers reported next to nothing about it, they knew that both inside and outside Central, the segregationist rabble was winning. "Faubus unleashed the idiots," lamented Harry Ashmore, the publisher of the Gazette, who, as Isaacs put it, stands out like a monument in Little Rock where nobody stands very high. Publicly, the city's most respectable figures conspicuously agonized. Hand-wringers and head-holders, Isaacs called them. But with the livelihoods of many of them dependent upon the bigots, they could always take their business to Memphis. They felt paralyzed. All felt too timid to speak out, except in their cups at the Little Rock Club to Harold Isaacs, a Jew, who, had he lived in town, would not have been allowed to join. "If you find any people with any decent convictions in this town, you'll find that they are also gutless. Gutless, gutless," a Joseph Cotton-like lawyer named Downey told him. A half-crocked businessman kept repeating the lyrics from South Pacific, "You've got to be taught to hate and fear," while his wife tried repeatedly to shush him up. Compulsive talking was a leitmotif, Isaacs learned. If they gabbed enough, people seemed to feel, maybe they could wiggle out of their predicament. Officially, Isaacs got only a few minutes with Faubus, but 2 hours later, the governor was still yakking as Isaacs edged his way to the door. Moderation in Little Rock seemed to cover everything from a rather weary and non-virulent pro-segregation to a timid and covert pro-integration. Isaacs wrote, "It was not a banner to rally an army, it was rather a ragged shelter under which all sorts of people could huddle in the storm while doing nothing." Newell gave him the local definition of moderate, saying Negro rather than nigger. Isaacs did not limit his interviews to the moderates. The lawyer for the Segregationist Mothers League, 38-year-old Griffin Smith, vouchsafed that the restaurant and the Hotel Marion, Little Rock's finest, wouldn't serve blacks in his lifetime. "This is not what the goddamn niggers want," a cab driver said while taking him to Central. "They want to go everywhere, the cafes and hotels and all. Pretty soon they'll push white people out of everywhere. There are too many of them." Wesley Pruden, a local pastor and another segregationist leader, told Isaacs that the NAACP was paying the black parents to keep the Nine in Central. "They'd take their children out in a minute if they could," he said. Isaacs learned that newsboys delivering the Gazette were terrified, and that because his daughter had said something favorable about integration, the bread made by a baker named Meyer was being thrown out into the street. Of the clergymen he interviewed, only the Reverend Dunbar Ogden, pastor of the local Presbyterian church and the sole white minister who, on that first day, had accompanied the black children to school, supported school desegregation. He found Ogden to be a tortured man, badgering, even begging Isaacs to judge him. "I could not undertake to help Ogden wrestle with his soul," Isaacs wrote, "but I was relieved to find him struggling anyway. I wouldn't have wanted not to have met in Little Rock at least one preacher of the gospel who at least showed an awareness of what it called upon him to be. The Jewish owners of the downtown department stores, politically moderate on most things, were running for cover, Daisy Bates told Isaacs. Having a Jewish reporter on the story, let alone one from the New York Times, let alone one who had publicly consoled one of the black girls, made them uneasy. One of the Jews here called the Times and said, "Why don't you send a white man down here to cover this story?" she recalled. The South wasn't ready for desegregation, one Jewish merchant, Sam Strauss of Pfeiffer's, told Isaacs. Isaacs asked Strauss how Jewish attitudes towards blacks in Little Rock differed from Hitler's anti-Semitism. "It's a question of color," Strauss replied. "Down here, we have our own customs. The more this kind of thing gets stirred up, the more anti-Semitism you get." One night at the Dunbar Community Center, Isaacs met 7 of the 9, including Elizabeth. "Smaller than she looked in those historic photographs," he noted. "I looked around at them and thought them lucky," he wrote. However each assimilated the experience, he or she was having at this early stage a chance for a finest hour. They had written themselves into history. Elizabeth told him of the letters she'd been receiving. "I've gotten many trying to apologize for what happened," Elizabeth said. "I'd say 2/3 are from the United States and about 1/3 from all sorts of foreign countries." It had rained torrentially for much of Isaac's stay in Little Rock, giving the place an almost biblical feel. One night, at the Little Rock Club, he announced to his new acquaintances that this was in fact the second flood, and that this time Noah was a black man. "No one around me thought this was funny, and indeed I hadn't meant it to be," he wrote. It rained still more on the day he was to leave, enough for him to worry he might not be able to flee what he called this flat and ugly city. Before his plane finally took off, Isaac scribbled a few last words in his notebook. "There are only 9 heroes in Little Rock," he wrote. "It's a war of nerves, and the nerves are the nerves of the 9 youngsters, sweating it out day after day inside Central High School. On their nerves the whole issue hangs, and the issue is a great one."
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. I will also make sure to remind folks, we are, even though this is only the 3rd session, we are pretty much halfway through with the book, Elizabeth and Hazel. Should only be 3 more sessions, and we should be all done. I was a little surprised myself, but looks like the audiobook is only about 8 hours, and by the end of the program today, we will be about halfway there. So you can already be thinking, if there are other books you would like to do, already be thinking. We'll start voting. If you all want to email, or if you want to verbalize it on the program, book you would like to do next. But we only have 3 more sessions on Elizabeth and Hazel, and then we'll be moving forward. So let's start getting feedback on that as well. Let's see. Person that dialed in 9325. Your line should be open. I'll get other hands as I see folks.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, greetings, Gus, to the other callers. Starting with chapter 15, I thought that that one of the things that stood out is the propaganda war that started to go on, and which is still going on today. But it seems the photograph started to make the town look bad. So as the photograph started to become damaging to the U.S. prestige, then it looks like the State Department got involved in this little propaganda war, making sure that they release other photographs showing blacks and whites getting along in harmony, which was not the case. But we have to keep up our image worldwide. So, as we move along, I thought it was interesting, too, that the pictures that Will Counts had taken, the most famous one, the one with Hazel and Elizabeth, was not the one that had won him the Pulitzer Prize. It was the pictures that he had taken around the football coach, giving his account of them killing those niggers, and probably the ones showing the black news reporters being plummeted with bricks and whatever else. The part about the formal welcome that the student council and the principal had planned for the black students, I doubt that very much planning went into that. I don't see how that even got past first base. And I thought it was strange that they keep mentioning the superintendent's daughter, but they don't give her a name. As we move along in chapter 17, they kind of flip the script a little bit when they talk about one of the worst things that you could be called during that time was a nigger lover. So that set the stage for the author to give the accounts of why the other students did not want to speak to the new black students or to have anything to do with, besides speaking to them and even getting to know them, they start to feel intimidated because of the peer pressure. One of them gave an account that they just would speak to Elizabeth just so that they could find out what it sounded like, referring to Elizabeth as a thing rather than a person. Can I still be heard?
Oh, yes, sir. We're with you.
Oh, okay. Okay. We go on to chapter 18. The students devised their own forms of counter-racism, although it's very crude. Did we make it to 18?
We have, you mean just in the audiobook? Yes, we went all the way through, I think, 20.
Oh, okay. Okay, they devised some counter-racist tactics, although they were crude, such as verbal sparring that Terrence Jefferson was doing. And I remember reading somewhere that someone had put straight pens into their books to help them ward off some of the attacks. And I wanted to, before I forget about it, Mr. Huckabee had estimated that a third of the teachers were against desegregation, although she was taking down a lot of the acts that were being that had been done upon the black students. It didn't go anywhere. This particular history teacher, Miss Pitton, her lessons were something out of Birth of a Nation. I take that as if she was probably one of the worst teachers there as far as being racist. She was just all out with hers, talking about the Klansmen, defending white womanhood, and Lincoln freeing slaves only because of tactical reasons, and doing Reconstruction. Blacks were just buffoons and ignoramuses. What was interesting is Elizabeth felt that the students from the prominent families should have said something about that. She thought that they would have been different because they were from prominent families. And I'll give one other interesting note before I give someone else. But Jackie Robinson is mentioned to have called the student. And it seems to me that during that time, Jackie Robinson, besides Joe Lewis, was probably the most famous black fourth figure or a black person during that era. And I was wondering why Melba would leave something that important out of her book, Warriors Don't Cry. And until I started reading this book, I thought that Melba Patilla Bill was considered the most famous of those nine. But after reading this book, I see that Elizabeth was a very significant figure, and mostly because of that photograph. Thank you for taking the call.
The person that called in from a block number, you should be with us as well.
Hi. I just wanted to call in and say that picture of Elizabeth with those two white girls, when they had the fire drill, that picture was photoshopped. Elizabeth was not really talking to those girls. If you see that, if your Kindle book or whatever has that photo, and I think that Margolick he really downplayed the harassment that they have to go through every day. Like saying Elizabeth was pushed one day and she was stuck with a pencil one day, and she had a fly thrown on her lunch tray one day. He just really downplayed it, and he called Minnie Jean combative, and Elizabeth. Minnie Jean was nothing like that. She was a really sweet girl. And also in the movie, when they had the movie, they purposely had Minnie Jean played by a dark-skinned girl, and I know that was on purpose. I mean, I'm not saying dark-skinned people are bad, but that's the way the media portrays, black people. They always have, the dark-skinned people be bad and stuff like that.
You're saying they made, in the movie, they made Minnie Jean the dark character because she's the one that got suspended for throwing the chili on the white person?
Yeah, and they made her, in the movie, they made her look like a troublemaker. Like she just came into the school. Like, I wish somebody would start some mess with me. That's basically how they had her, acting. Well, I haven't seen the movie in a real long time, but that's that's kind of what I remember. But I do remember her, they having her played by a dark-skinned girl.
Fascinating.
Have you ever seen the movie before?
I have not. I have been trying to find, I'm aware of two. I think Disney did one, the Ernest Green story, and then there's another one, Crisis at Central High, and they both like 30 years old, maybe even more than that.
That's the one.
Crisis.
That's the one I saw, Crisis at Central High.
Okay. Yeah, I've been trying to track it down. I have failed thus far. If anybody out there, if you find it someplace, I would love to see it, because they talk about that movie later on in this book. They talk about that film, and apparently they went and talked to Elizabeth Eckford and some of the other members of the Little Rock Nine in the process of making that film. But that's down the road. That'll come up in the book.
Okay. Yeah, and I was like I was saying about that picture that was Photoshop. I just want to say, that they, to try to, like smooth things over, like, oh yeah, everything's getting along good. Look at Elizabeth, she's talking to those girls and all that, and they wasn't even in the same picture together. That's all I want to say. And I'm mute.
Oh, I think also with that photograph, the one point that he did make, which should not be lost, is that they lied and captioned the photograph saying, "Oh, Elizabeth is outside having a wonderful integrated time at Central High, and she's talking it up with some of the students during a fire drill." And that wasn't true at all. It was a bomb scare from some trifling racists who threatened to, do a Boston Marathon back then, which shouldn't be lost either. And that does fit. I think that fits a pattern that we've heard in both of these books, how the terrorism was, and to your point, continues to be downplayed, minimized. Hey, it wasn't that bad. It was just a handful of students. They didn't really suffer through anything. That it was just spitballs and paper clips. This is just normal childhood tomfoolery. That's all. Nothing. Not urine being thrown in someone's face or bleach being thrown in someone's eyes. Bomb threats. Dynamite. Right.
Yeah. And how come at the end of the school day in speech class, the students were supposed to be so nice to her? What was so different about speech class, and how come she sat in the front in that class, and she sat in the back of all the other classes? Because of course she felt threatened. Of course, sitting, that's why she sat in the back. But what was it so special in speech class that made her feel safer, and all the students were nice to her, and some of them were nice to her? That doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand that. I guess it's kind of trying to say like that teacher, she didn't take no foolishness, and she from those racists and whatever, and so she I guess she pretty much made sure all the students got along. That's what I kind of gleaned from that, but that sounds kind of like fairy tales or something to me. It didn't sound right.
Fairy tales.
Is that a bad word to use?
Well, the word fair is one that I pay attention to, and it's certainly a derivative of that word. But yeah, I think she had went in before about what you said about the speech teacher, the white woman, racist suspect. She maybe was a bit more of a disciplinarian, so the racist children couldn't get away with as much there. So maybe she felt, maybe she felt like that was an environment where some of the other racists, they could be pleasant to her, and I guess it was only a handful of them. Actually, that reminded me of one of the major points. I don't know if they were listening from the very beginning, where you heard the intro, the interview at NPR, where Elizabeth Eckford, Melba Patilla Beals, and one of the males, they were on, and she mentioned that. She said that they asked her, what would she tell current students? And she said that you have so much power. And this was the example that she gave about realizing how much power that you have, even as a young child. And she said, the students in the speech class, she's talking about these are white people, white students, her white classmates. She said that she'd be terrorized and abused all day long, and then she would get to the speech class, and it would be a warm look, a smile, a pat on the back, and that meant so. This is her illustration of power. White people smiling at her, maybe saying hi to her, a pat on the back. That is huge, and not in a degrading, let me talk bad about this dumb Negro. Yeah. No, that is us. That's what happens to us when you get terrorized, when you get assaulted every day. Just one white person smiling, not calling you a nigger. In fact, a victim of mine, he used to say this to his sister all the time: the absence of mistreatment is not good treatment. And I don't think we get that at all. If it happens to be a white person and they're not calling us names, they're not terrorizing us, particularly in that environment. You don't have a stick of dynamite in your pocket ready to hit me. You don't have a lynch rope in your back pocket. Like, you're just being pleasant. You're letting me know what our homework was. Oh my God, this is Jesus. This is Mother Mary. I mean, it really, all of us, and again, I cannot emphasize that enough. All of us suffer from that as a part of racism, white supremacy. I'll mute my line.
Oh, also, I was going to say, you call that, this kind of off the subject, but at the beginning of the show, you called that governor of Massachusetts a racist suspect, and he's a black man. A black male.
Thank you. A listener emailed me during the audio clip. I was supposed to say that at the very beginning. Thank you. I made an error. Governor Deval Patrick, non-white male. He is not a racist suspect. I thought he was a white person. Made an error. Still would go with the point, because I said a non-white person wouldn't be able to do that. You would have to have some white people in matter of fact, I can't even imagine a black man. Imagine President Obama trying to come out and tell all the white people they're going to have to stay in their house for unspecified amount of time, how they would respond. White people have got to be behind Governor Deval Patrick on this order. But I did make an error. Thank you all both for catching that.
How about the part of the book where the history teacher would call on Elizabeth sometimes, but when they took up money for the weekly newspaper, she didn't want to touch Elizabeth. And you can see a lot of that today in customer service. When you are receiving your change, sometimes the people will, if they don't put your change on the counter, they will carefully try to avoid contact with you. And if you're in line and you're next, and a white person is present, they'll say, "Who was next?" And they know good and well that you were next. But the kicker is that some non-white people will even relinquish their spot in the line and say, "Well, you go ahead." In a case like that, that never happens to me, because if they ever say, "Who's next?" I don't even respond. I just step forward for myself.
Whenever that's happened to me, like if I'm at a bank, at the bank or something, and and I'm standing there for quite a while, waiting for the person ahead of me to get done, and it was maybe a white lady comes up, she stands next to me, and the white person, the teller, she knows that I'm next, but she'll say, "Who's next?" And I just stand there, and the white person always say, "Oh, I think she was before me," and they always let me go first, because I don't say nothing, because I don't want them to be calling security on me and acting silly. I try to keep it calm and try to keep as nondescript as I can when I'm out dealing with white folks. But I understand your point. That, the way we live, that would make you feel, do that,
And I may be going a little overboard with this stuff, but I was listening to Creed show one time. They did a study to where white men would open the door for black men and tell them to go ahead of them, and then you would be standing there, no, go ahead, no, you. But I found that to be just the opposite, because I've seen them, men and women, if you reach the door at the same time as they do, they're going to stand there like they're expecting you to open the door for them. You have to be, mindful of this, because I think that they would very much like the things to go back to the way that it was.
The white men, they always open the door for me, even though I don't like it whenever we reach the door first. And I really hate to say this, but I've never had a black man open the door for me. In fact, I was going out of a door, and I was loaded down on some boxes, and this black man went out first, and I thought he was going to hold the door open for me. He let that door slam right in my face. I was so mad, and I'm not giving white men props, nothing like that, but I've never been at a door, and there's been a white man, and he's not held the door open for me. No matter how old or how young he is, they always do that. But some black females, they just really make a big deal about it. They say, "Oh yeah, get you a white man, because white men, they open the door open for you. They open the car door for you. They really know how to treat a woman and all that." I'm like, that don't mean nothing. That doesn't mean anything. They probably just open the door for you because they want to see your butt when you walk in the door or something.
Go ahead, Gus.
You can continue. I could hear what your last comment was, but it was a little bit muffled. If you could speak clearer, if possible, that would be helpful. I was just going to say really quickly about the impact that when you continue to get rude, discourteous treatment from other victims, and then you get courteous treatment from a white person, or even the absence of discourteous treatment from a white person, I think frequently that does have an impact on non-white people. I'd say just, listen to Elizabeth Eckford, even Melba Patilla Beals. And I think they've even talked about it in the story, talking about how many black people were not pleased with them, and they were suffering as a result of this whole quote-unquote integration experiment too. So just getting that, holding the door open, even today, you hear that same thing where it's black males, black females, where they are victimized, they've been mistreated, and then they get a white person who's nice to them, will buy them a cup of coffee or a scrap of bread, and it has such a huge impact. And it goes back to that white identification, Stockholm syndrome, whatever term you want to put on it, but just understanding why that happens. The male caller, did you want to share?
Yes. I was going to say that I noticed the difference in the mindset of Elizabeth as opposed to Melba, and their perspective, family environments, the way that they looked at things. Elizabeth did not seem to have this feeling of not having a black male role model in a protective role, because she had her grandfather who could look white people straight in the face, and he owned a store, and her father who would attempt to stand up for her, as opposed to Melba not having that figure in her life. And so they have two different perspectives on life and how they deal with white people.
Yeah.
That is an interesting perspective, the difference in perhaps how it molded these two black females and how they responded the presence or absence of a older black male. Melba Patilla Beals, her father and mother getting divorced, and her father kind of exiting the scene as things got rolling, and her father, I remember it had that scene early in the book where her father was saying he didn't want her to do this because he thought they could lose their job, which did happen, and that it could just bring a lot of problems for a lot of black people, which is true. And they kind of fussed at him, and he left, and you don't really see too much of him. And then with Elizabeth, her having contact with her grandfather who owned the store, as she said, maybe having a difference, because masculinity is a big theme in Melba Patilla Beals' book, where she talks about, her disappointment. I think she captures it beautifully at the end, her disappointment with black masculinity, not being able to provide protection, and how she got that from Danny, from the 101st, as well as her future white husband, and even linked to some degree. So, great point, great contrast.
And it seemed like as she was educated, but it seemed like she would have seen that, how black males are emasculated, especially coming from the South. But just because a person is educated in the white folks' standard of academia doesn't mean that they have the common sense that we're all supposed to. We black people should have, as it relates to being black, and that's probably why she was with she married a white man, and and also because Elizabeth, she wanted to marry a black guy, but her mother talked her out of it, and but she did have both of her sons by black males, so.
That should come up later in the book as well as when we were talking earlier about the classmates who were in with Elizabeth in speech and apparently were nice to her. These are white classmates. That's going to come up in the book later as well. So keep an ear out. Don't know if it'll. No, it's cool. It's just It's going to reoccur. It's going to something that will be addressed again in this book. I don't know if it'll be this week though. Joe from DC should be with us as well. Joe from DC, do you have commentary on the book we're talking about, Elizabeth and Hazel?
Yes, Gus, another great show. Just calling and just wanted to let you know real quick, I'm actually in California. Just wanted to say hi to you from your neck of the woods. And I wanted to speak on what the gentleman brought up, the lady brought up about his masculinity. I've noticed that as far as masculinity, if you're trying to make it in the corporate world, you have to almost humble yourself if you really want to make it. And I guess that's kind of how you look at President Obama. Even though he has all the education and smarts, he can't really speak out like he wants. He'll be out of there. And that's kind of how I feel as far as being emasculated. That's something that I think as a black man going in the corporate world that I think sometimes black women don't always understand. It's kind of like I'm fighting them and I'm fighting you trying to get my place. And it's kind of like when you think you have that support from a sister or women in that environment who's actually going through the same thing, you think that you would get more love, but I guess that's something that we all have to worry about. And the other point I wanted to speak to, as far as opening the door for black women, I noticed that I have to say, hey, are you going to let me do my job? Brothers do open the door for women, and I do hear a lot of black women say, well, I'm not used to that. And then I always say to myself, well, what kind of men are you dating? What kind of men do you deal with that don't give you that respect that you deserve? And I think sometimes, even speaking to the book, is that what kind of men do you date? Or what kind of men do you have in your life that don't, give you that respect that you need?
I was going to talk about the emasculating of the black male, when he has to go into the workforce. I've noticed that I've noticed a few African males when they first come here and they're not acclimated to, this society, their masculinity is in full force. Their voices are deep and, they're just really masculine, just dripping with masculinity. But I assume that after, several years of being here, they, have to temper that down. And I also know that, and I've heard from African females that a lot of African males become alcoholics too when they come here. And I think that has to do a lot because my daughter, she works in a nursing home, and she said that she works with this guy from Ethiopia, and she said he told her he had never even heard of the term gay, or he had never heard of males being sexually attracted to other males until he came to this country. I just find that very interesting. I was just really blown away that she told me that. And I also saw on one of the current TV channels on the current TV channel that said in Uganda they were putting people to death, black people to death that were gay, and they had white people over there who were gay and trying to educate the black people and telling them that that's a natural thing and it's not something people choose, and it shouldn't be demoralizing people that are gay. And I'm like, that's terrible. White people, spreading that poison all over the world.
That is the system we live in. Veered a little off topic. Try to get back to the book here, Elizabeth and Hazel. We'll go ahead and do our second audio clip, and then that'll leave us ample time to discuss. So if folks have other things that they want to touch on, bring up, we'll have ample time after the second audio clip to continue to address issues. If there are things people have from the first audio segment, write it down, save it, don't forget it. We'll have time to discuss, and then we'll also address what comes up during the second portion of the book. The people that dialed in, if you can mute your line, that would be helpful. If you are not able to do so, I can do it for you. Just keep the background noise down while the audio plays. As soon as it's done, we'll be right back for the second audio clip. I'll give out the number once we get back. Context of White Supremacy, Elizabeth and Hazel, segment number 2.
Chapter 20. Shortly before Christmas, the 9 would have an even more distinguished visitor. He was Dr. Kenneth Clark, the psychologist whose findings on the harmfulness of segregated education had buttressed the NAACP's case in Brown. As Clark explained to Daisy Bates, he and his family would be spending the holidays in Hot Springs, only a couple of hours away. Needless to say, I could not be so close to Little Rock without coming by to talk with you and the 9 youngsters who have so bravely fought our battles, he told her. In fact, the Southern Regional Council had commissioned him to investigate how they, and the black community generally, were holding up. He first met them at a Christmas party thrown by a black sorority, but he learned little there. The students were having too good a time to talk with me about Central High School. So he met with them individually in the next few days. He found them in surprisingly good shape. Centuries of oppression, he theorized, had endowed them with ample survival skills. In fact, to Clark, their greatest danger was overconfidence. Some irresponsible, fanatical hothead might do something terrible to them when they weren't looking. Clark put together appraisals of each, which were omitted from his final report. He'd been impressed with the 3 boys and smitten with Gloria Ray and Minnie Jean Brown. He had reservations about Melba Patillo, suggesting that she was a publicity hound. With Elizabeth, who had joined him and his wife for dinner one night in Hot Springs, he was surprisingly detached and low-key, failing to note her role as the first, the most famous, and the most traumatized of the group. Still, his assessment was the most in-depth and expert of any taken at the time. It made clear that for all of the troubles it had brought her, integration had already fulfilled for Elizabeth one of its principal missions, which was to give her insight into another race. Elizabeth Eckford gives the impression of being rather shy and somewhat introverted. As you get to know her and talk with her, you are impressed with a depth, solidity, and maturity which seem extraordinary for a 16-year-old. She, too, is calm and reflective as she discusses the tensions and deliberate cruelties which she has experienced in Central High School. She discusses, without passion, her dread of the jostling and name-calling in the halls, in gym, and in the lunchroom. She and Terence are the more obvious stoics in their reaction to the systematic harassment which these 9 students are required to experience in Central High School. She describes these cruelties in rather matter-of-fact terms. She faces her anxiety about them. She describes the whites who perpetuate these attempts at humiliation or physical damage as being silly. When I asked her what was the most important thing that she has learned as a result of her experience at Central High School, she answered in her deliberative manner, "When I used to go to Horace Mann's school, I thought that white people were different. When I saw the colored kids at Horace Mann acting silly or doing something that I didn't think they should do, I said to myself that they did this just because they were colored. Now that I am at Central High School, I see that white children do silly things too. Just like there are dumb colored children, there are some dumb whites. There are some average colored, and there are some average whites, and there are some smart whites and some smart colored. I guess what I have learned is that they are not so different, and we aren't so different." When her father suggested that maybe she was working a little harder on her schoolwork than she worked at Horace Mann, she refused to accept this, and insisted that she worked as hard as she could at Horace Mann, and she is working as hard as she can at Central High School. She stated this with a firm, matter-of-fact conviction, and her father had to accept her interpretation in spite of the fact that it did not agree with his. Elizabeth, Jefferson Thomas, and Terence Roberts were quite disturbed at the cumulative cruelties which they have had to endure, Clark noted. For Elizabeth, the worst class was gym, and not just because she was poor at sports. Supervision there was spotty, so her tormentors could run amok. Girls put broken glass on the shower room floor, or scalded her by flushing all the toilets simultaneously. Everyone in the adjoining showers somehow knew just when to step aside, or threw flaming spitballs into the stalls. Minnie Jean had been a help, not only protecting, but commiserating. When things got really tough, Elizabeth and I would think of Jackie Robinson, she later said. We felt if he could do it, we could too. With one exception, Clark concluded, the black students had reacted positively to the limelight. He did not identify that exception, but for those who knew the 9, it wasn't really necessary. Chapter 21. The new year brought only more abuse, particularly as the troublemakers realized they risked little more than a slap on the wrist or a brief and often welcome suspension for any misbehavior. That, in turn, led the few school officials, teachers, soldiers, and students otherwise inclined to push back, essentially to stop trying. School officials had some sense of which parents were behind the harassment. Mrs. Huckabee later claimed that the Central Intelligence Agency installed an agent in Little Rock that year, even finding his wife a job in a local beauty parlor to pick up gossip, but they were never reined in either. Elizabeth continued to suffer disproportionately. Apart from being the most vulnerable, she was also the most symbolically potent. If only they could drive out the girl who had come to epitomize the 9, the segregationists may have hoped, the others would quickly follow, and the whole integrationist edifice would crumble. January 10th. Elizabeth shoved from behind on the stairs. "I was in a hurry, and this little old nigger was in my way," Darlene Holloway, who was suspended, explained. January 12th. Someone spits on Elizabeth's hand. January 14th. Elizabeth pushed down onto stairs, face forward, comes crying to Mrs. Huckabee's office. "It's a wonder she didn't pop her teeth out on the concrete and steel," a report states. January 22nd. Elizabeth spat on again. January 29th. Elizabeth attacked with spitballs. January 30th. Elizabeth asks to study in Mrs. Huckabee's office rather than attend pep rally. January 31st, after girls serenade her with humiliating songs in gym, Elizabeth asks grandfather to take her home. "You mean you can't control these kids?" her incredulous grandfather asks. "Not without community backing," Mrs. Huckabee replies. "It's hard to put these Negro children, the best reared of their group, up against our near delinquents," Mrs. Huckabee wrote her brother. "They couldn't retaliate even if they knew how, of course, being such a tiny minority." These near delinquents were easily spotted. Though there were exceptions, they were generally the ones with the leather jackets and ducktail haircuts from the poorer parts of town who tucked Luckies into their T-shirt sleeves and smoked during recess. To Powell, hell-raising, jumping on the fun wagon, accounted for their misbehavior as much as bigotry. "These types don't especially hate coloreds, but they do enjoy attention," he said. After a good day's harassing, some went directly to Steve's show to dance. It was all of a piece, all in search of a good time. In history class, a boy named Charles Sawrey, with bad skin and a protruding Adam's apple, sat behind Elizabeth, muttering, "Nigger, nigger, 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 nigger," at her daily, while more respectable classmates looked the other way. "I don't remember anything about Elizabeth except she was black, and my job was to make it as rough for the blacks as I could, and that's what I did," he recalled with embarrassment years later. Elizabeth never complained. She actually felt sorry for Sawrey, who clearly came from poverty himself. Along with race, both class and peer pressure were very much at work. Marginalized whites made names for themselves by treating the even more marginalized blacks with as much conspicuous cruelty as possible. Sawrey briefly became a folk hero by clobbering Ernest Green with a biology book as the principal stood nearby. Their tormentors resented Elizabeth and the others, because for all the abuse they were taking, some people actually cared about them. As loathsome as their behavior was, there was also a kind of honesty and directness to these young people. One knew what they were about. For Elizabeth, at least, they were preferable to the vastly larger group of better students who did nothing, who pretended nothing was amiss, who simply carried on and looked the other way. These students could mobilize when it suited them. For instance, the captain of the football team escorted Blossom's daughter between classes. For some reason, perhaps tactical, perhaps some perverse form of chivalry, the rabble-rousers divided their tasks by sex. Most of Elizabeth's tormentors were girls. Unlike Hazel, whose misbehavior had been ad hoc and short-lived, their actions were sustained and coordinated. When James Lawson of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, who had once instructed Martin Luther King, Jr. in nonviolence, met with the nine, he advised them to protect their midsections. Elizabeth was way ahead of him. Her loose-leaf binder had always doubled as a shield, but now she enhanced her defenses. A house full of seamstresses had plenty of extra straight pins, and she stuck them around the edges of her book. After that, she was hit from the front only once. The situation grew worse for Elizabeth in February, when Minnie Jean, who'd been reinstated a few weeks earlier, was finally expelled for calling one of her harassers white trash. She would finish the school year in New York. Along with the other black students, Elizabeth accompanied her to the airport, wishing she too could have boarded that plane. For her part, Minnie Jean worried about Elizabeth. What would happen to her now that her closest friend would no longer be around? She could easily have been speaking for Elizabeth when she described the world she was leaving behind. "I don't think people realize what goes on at Central," said Minnie Jean. "They throw rocks, they spill ink on your clothes, they call you nigger, they just keep bothering you every 5 minutes." Around Central, little printed cards soon appeared. "1 down, 8 to go," they proclaimed. February 4th, Elizabeth has soda bottle thrown at her. February 13th, Elizabeth unable to reach father's car when, as soldiers run for cover, 9 boys throw snow-covered rocks at black students. After her experiences on the first day, Elizabeth's parents had no longer let her ride city buses to school. Either her father or her grandfather would take her, even though for her grandfather this meant closing his store. Oscar Eckford Sr. loved money. To his granddaughter, shutting his place was the ultimate act of love. At night, with her father at the train station, two neighbors, Mr. Brown and Mr. Bullock, patrolled around the Eckford house. Even before the school crisis, her mother always had a .45, and hearing something suspicious on several occasions, she opened the door a crack and shot outside. Just about the only fate that did not befall Elizabeth was the one that Radio Moscow reported on January 25th, that she'd been brutally murdered. That gave the Voice of America a rare chance to chortle. If the Soviet report was news to Americans as a whole, it was especially so to the supposed victim who merely laughed when informed of her violent demise, it said. That month, just around the time her father's union, the dining car employees, awarded a $1,000 scholarship to Elizabeth, the press reported that she was about to quit Central. Several afternoons, in fact, she had left school vowing never to return, only to change her mind by morning. But as the year progressed, something descended on Elizabeth that never fully lifted. She walked with her head down, as if she wanted to make sure the floor didn't open up beneath her, is how Jefferson Thomas described it. To those inside Central, who looked neither away from nor through her, there developed another indelible image of Elizabeth Eckford, this one uncommitted to film. A slight, solitary girl, in modest but brightly colored handmade clothes, walking, solemnly, purposefully, warily, along Central's corridors, no one ever around her, books clasped tightly to her chest. 50 years later, a Little Rock lawyer named Josh McHughes could still see her, plain as day. He wanted to approach her and reassure her, or say hello, or simply smile, but neither he nor anyone else ever did. You just got out of her way and went about your business. There were taunts in the hallway. "Good morning, nigger, aren't you all going to talk some of that coon jab you speak?" And days when students collectively stared at her, or walked on her heels. In assemblies, the black students sat by themselves, listening to the rebel yells and choruses of Dixie. Only the handful of Japanese-American students, children of families left over from the internment camps in Arkansas to which they'd been sent during World War II, were as isolated. March 7th, egg thrown at Elizabeth, lands on her coat and books. Locker also broken. March 12th, Elizabeth hit on back by rotten tomato. She said that except for some broken glass thrown at her during lunch, she really had had a wonderful day, Mrs. Huckabee writes. Over time, she grew increasingly intent on going it alone. Elizabeth is more anxious to be independent than safe, Mrs. Huckabee later wrote. Really, Elizabeth had little choice. Even had she been inclined to confide in someone, there was no one to whom to turn. She couldn't turn to Daisy Bates in the NAACP, which, she believed, thrived on the students' martyrdom and wanted to make desegregation work. She couldn't turn to her mother, who'd have yanked her out of Central had she known what was happening there, or to her grandfather, because she'd not have wanted him to know how weak she felt she was, or to her father, who paid little heed to her plight. Just a little pushing and shoving, was how he later characterized it. Black America was at war, was how he saw it, and Elizabeth was doing her soldierly duty. Besides, he'd never seen any marks on her. His attitude anticipated some controversial comments made 2 years later by the philosopher Hannah Arendt concerning the proper role of children, parents, courts, and organizations in civil rights crusades. Elizabeth couldn't talk to the other black students, except in gym, where they were paired off. None were in her classes, and away from Central was the last thing they wanted to discuss. Even had they wanted to talk, they sensed that Elizabeth didn't. She was a real psychological mess, Terence Roberts recalled. I always had the feeling that whatever was going on, she was not about to say it to anyone. It was going to be hers alone. Despite facile assumptions, invariably by whites, that they were monolithic and intimate, the 9 were really not particularly close, either at Central or for decades afterward, no closer really than any 9 people thrown together by circumstances would be. At no point during that year, for instance, did Elizabeth set foot in the homes of Ernest Green, Melba Patillo, Jefferson Thomas, or Gloria Ray. Gloria had a party once and did not invite her. Denied the chance at Central, some of the others participated in extracurricular events at Horace Mann, but Elizabeth's mother, ever eager to keep her close to home, would never have allowed that. Elizabeth couldn't talk to friends. There were so few to begin with. Most were really her sisters, and hoping to avoid trouble, they steered clear of her. She couldn't talk to her minister, as some of the others, Ernest, Melba, Minnie Jean, Gloria, could. The goings-on at Central were rarely discussed at her church, whose pastor wasn't eager to rock too many boats, and never pulled her aside to comfort her. She couldn't talk to the local press. Blossom had instructed them not to, and Daisy Bates didn't want them to either. Every time they print something about the kids have to face it the next day in school, she told the NAACP. And besides, the local press wasn't much interested. The Democrats sided with the segregationists, and while the Gazette was more progressive, it won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for its coverage that year, it largely ducked the story after the first few weeks. One exception came in late November, when it put 6 reporters on the case. Teachers, students say Central High seethes with myriad undercurrents, the ensuing headline blared. But the story itself was timid, and ended on an incongruous and unconvincingly sanguine note. A white girl in a gym class tosses a Negro girl's shoe out the window, and the Negro girl cries. But then it is common for white girls to throw other white girls' shoes out the window. Maybe it isn't such an unusual school after all. None of the black school children were interviewed for the story, in part because none of the interviewers was black. A decade would pass before the paper hired its first black reporter. The 9 remained, as the former Gazette man Gene Foreman put it, cardboard characters in the paper, and all but invisible in the Democrat. Local television was even more skittish. When NBC staged a discussion between 4 white school children, some of them segregationists, and 3 of the blacks, its Little Rock affiliate wouldn't carry the program. Those people who attacked Benjamin Fine were in fact onto something. It was the hated Yankees who wrote most penetratingly about life inside Central. Technically, these are the most protected school children in the world. One of the most persistent of them, Stan Opatowski of the New York Post, wrote from Little Rock that spring, noting that the Supreme Court, the Army, and the local school board were behind them. But in reality, they walk alone. You see them move down the twisted halls of Central High in a quick, tense gait, eyes riveted to the floor, fearful and expectant. Opatowski looked on as someone dropped a cup of water down a stairwell and heard raucous laughter reverberate through the halls when the water landed on a black girl's face. One of the few sympathetic white students, Robin Woods, told him the blacks were in a state of shock. "They jump when you speak," she said. "The other day I smiled and said hello to Elizabeth Eckford, and she looked so startled. She looked as though she were waiting for me to say something bad after I said hello." In the chatter and laughter of the corridors, this observer saw no white student stop to talk or even smile with the black students, Gertrude Samuels of the New York Times wrote in March. It was as though they were in a hostile land where no one spoke their language. Elizabeth told Samuels that she divided the student body into 3 groups. First, the majority, civil and courteous, who might like Negroes if they had a chance. Second, those who attacked them verbally. And third, those who actually tried to hurt them. "I knew it was going to be rough," she said, "but knowing it and experiencing it are different things." And here was the final, most important outlet unavailable to Elizabeth. She couldn't talk to the 2,000-odd students around her. Most of them wouldn't think of hurting her. If you were from a respectable family, you'd never call anyone nigger, or hit her, or trip her, but they didn't do anything good either. It was an attitude neatly captured in the school newspaper, the Central High School Tiger. As Mike Barrier, the student who wrote most of the paper's few stories on the subject, later put it, the message from on high was to depict a normal school year with a few hundred extra Army personnel on the premises. When the subject of the black students was raised, it was done elliptically or in code, and always understatedly. To say that hostility is non-existent would not be true, but in many hearts there has never been any prejudice, went an article from November, which, to its credit, hinted at some of the teachers' attitudes. Reserving their personal opinions for themselves, they have never neglected their duties. Having barely acknowledged any abnormality that fall, the Tiger suggested in January that normality had returned. Negro students no longer draw stares as they walk down the halls, it stated. As a topic of discussion, integration has become pretty thoroughly secondary. None of the 9 was ever interviewed nor even identified in the Tiger that year. An item detailing an award alumnus Will Counts had won for his now famous picture of Elizabeth and Hazel managed to omit what that picture depicted. In fairness, the student journalists enjoyed little latitude. The paper's faculty advisor, Miss Edna Middlebrook, belonged, like Elizabeth's history teacher, Miss Penton, to the Daughters of the Confederacy. Officially, then, all was fine at Central High School. No child has been physically injured, no persons in town have been killed or seriously hurt, and no teacher has resigned his or her position, Jess Matthews told a group of educators that March. Life within the school has been very normal. Looking back on his 90th birthday in early 1958, W.E.B. Du Bois painted a bleak picture of life for American blacks, whom he characterized as bewildered and scared. "Only the children like those in Little Rock stand and fight," he wrote. That was little consolation to Elizabeth or her peers, but feeling that she couldn't let the others down, Elizabeth finished out the year. The last 10 days or so she didn't need to be at Central much, and she was grateful for the reprieve. Her class ring, it was onyx and gold, the school's colors, became one of the few tangible mementos of her time there, and only until she lost it sometime over the summer. Having been absent when her homeroom picture was taken, perhaps while Faubus kept her and the others out, her face appeared nowhere in the yearbook. It was as if she had never been there. Chapter 22. That summer, the Little Rock 9, who had already proven to be potent fundraisers for the NAACP, went on the road. Apart from a childhood trip to St. Louis that she couldn't remember, it was Elizabeth's first time away from home, and her first time in a plane. But that didn't matter. She was just excited to be out of Little Rock and the South. That June, the group was feted for 3 days in New York, in a program organized by the local branch of the Hotel and Club Employees Union. After a tearful reunion with Minnie Jean at the airport, the 9 received an award from the union. Among those saluting them was Governor Averell Harriman. The next day, Mayor Robert Wagner met the group at City Hall, and after a press conference, they toured the United Nations, where they saw Ralph Bunche and Dag Hammarskjöld. Bunche doubted that he'd have shown their restraint. In his own high school days, he told them, he had been a chip-on-the-shoulder type. On Broadway that night, they watched Lena Horne and Ricardo Montalban in Jamaica, then met with the stars backstage. Elizabeth collected signatures on an autograph hound, a cloth dachshund that was, for her, a substitute for conversation. Then it was on to Times Square and a midnight snack at Lindy's. What most amazed Elizabeth was that a fancy restaurant served sandwiches. The next day featured the Empire State Building and Statue of Liberty. Elizabeth was too scared to go to the top of either, and Coney Island, she skipped the roller coaster, with a ride on the New York subway in between. There was church on Sunday before they left. In Chicago, They collected an award from the Chicago Defender and met Mayor Richard J. Daley. To Elizabeth, he looked like a teamster. In Cleveland, they accepted the Spingarn Prize. It had previously gone to W.E.B. Du Bois, Marian Anderson, Jackie Robinson, and Martin Luther King, among others, from the NAACP. All this time away was a balm for Elizabeth. From then forward, whenever she returned to Little Rock, she left her bags packed, anticipating her next escape. In August, the 9 went to Washington, where they toured the White House and were Johnny Mathis's special guests at a television show produced in a local hotel. When Mathis learned that the segregated establishment would not admit them, he arranged for them to sit separately on stage. Outside the Supreme Court, they posed with Thurgood Marshall. "Never position yourself on the edge of a group picture," he counseled Elizabeth. "You might get cropped out." Of course, that would have been fine with her. Elizabeth's demoralizing experience at Central had snuffed out her plans to enter law or any plans at all. But Marshall, funny, profane, the only man gutsy enough to talk back to Daisy Bates, the only lawyer representing the children who actually talked to them, well, she had a crush on him. In a parade sponsored by Washington's Negro Elks, the 9 appeared on a float, sitting at desks to which their names had been attached. Along with the others, Elizabeth received a $1,000 scholarship from the group. Her "I wish to express gratitude" is nervously spoken, hurried, and her slight body trembles, wrote Mary Stratford in the Washington Afro-American, adding that Elizabeth appeared no more comfortable there than she had been amid the mob outside Central. Elizabeth's self-contained, reserved demeanor suggests a sign marked "Private, do not enter," Stratford continued. She has a great capacity for quietness. At summer's end, Bertie Eckford lost her job at the Deaf and Blind School, retaliation, Elizabeth believed, for her role in the Little Rock drama. Then, in the final paroxysm of the old order, local voters decreed that rather than integrate, the city's public high schools would close for the 1958-59 year. Central's football team nonetheless played a full schedule. Most whites went to hastily put-together private schools or to public schools out of town. Some northern institutions offered slots to the black students, but fearful that sending them away would render an ongoing court case moot, Daisy Bates had not accepted. To Elizabeth, another respect in which they were sacrificed for the cause. To Elizabeth, Bates was a self-promoter. Though the other black students felt little affection for Bates, some thought that judgment unduly harsh, as Elizabeth's judgments of others tended to be. There can be no doubt that Bates played a crucial role in the desegregation of Central High School, and that she and her husband, their lives and home repeatedly threatened, the newspaper they owned eventually forced to close, paid an enormous price for their courage. The 9 scattered. Ernest Green graduated, Terrence Roberts moved to Los Angeles, and Gloria Ray to Kansas City. Minnie Jean Brown returned to New York. Elizabeth remained in Little Rock, studying algebra and English with a tutor, and French via an extension course from the University of Arkansas. When an official from the Hotel Workers Union polled the 9 to find out how they were coping, Elizabeth expressed frustration. "However, I am keeping up on some of the reading," she noted. "Right now I am reading Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, and after that I think I will try King Lear." Shakespeare, she explained, was a requirement for 12th grade English. She also hung around her grandfather's store, listening to him when she wasn't reading books. That summer, the NAACP placed each of the 9 in safe houses in black neighborhoods in big cities away from Little Rock. Along with Jefferson Thomas and Thelma Mothershed, Elizabeth lived with Frankie Muse Freeman, a prominent NAACP lawyer in St. Louis. Her father's co-workers on the railroad made sure Eckford's kid was well cared for throughout the trip there. She got to ride free on the Missouri Pacific. Other lines charged her a penny a mile. Perhaps the first person to whom Elizabeth spoke candidly about her experiences, Freeman recognized her fragility. She made sure Elizabeth did fun things, visits to a friend's pool, movies, but always within the black community, so that no whites, especially white reporters, knew she was in town. The others ventured out much more freely. It was during this summer that Elizabeth first tried to kill herself. It wasn't really premeditated. In fact, she had been having a good time, but one day she swallowed a bottle of over-the-counter sleeping pills. There hadn't been enough of them, and she was never really in any danger. That she had even tried became apparent only from her grogginess the next morning. At the Freemans' insistence, she then saw her first psychiatrist, and she was never allowed to lock her bedroom door again. When, after moderate elements in Little Rock finally prevailed, Central reopened in September 1959, the school's black population had been reduced to 5, including 2 of the original 9, Carlotta Walls and Jefferson Thomas. Though still a few credits short of graduating, she never did collect a Central diploma. Elizabeth opted instead to attend Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. Knox suited her desire for a small school and had been recommended by the National Scholarship Service and Fund for Negro Students. Still, when the school year began at Central, Elizabeth showed up, just to lend Jefferson some support. Carlotta was still at summer school. He would need it. Many of the segregationist students would also be returning. Only the press would be gone. "I know how bad it was when there were 9 of us," she told Ted Poston. "It would be 10 times as bad if no one was with him." When word came of fresh trouble brewing outside the school, Daisy Bates asked Elizabeth whether she was sure she wanted to return. "You didn't think I was going to chicken out at this last moment, do you?" Elizabeth replied. Elizabeth and Jefferson rode to the school with Carl Rowan, then a young reporter with the Minneapolis Tribune. As the police held back another jeering crowd, Elizabeth went inside Central for a few hours. "I don't think they'll stay after the way they were treated today," one student said afterward. "Elizabeth sat there in the middle of the room and no one spoke to her." "I'm glad and I'm proud, although I've been thanking God she didn't have to go back to Central," Bertie Eckford said afterward. Knox College is a small liberal arts institution with a proud abolitionist background. It was one of the first schools to give a black woman a degree. When she arrived on campus, accompanied by Daisy Bates, Elizabeth was one of 12 black students. Scholarships paid her way, covering even her books. Initially, she felt liberated. Knox was the first place in which she could really express her feelings. After so many years in the cocoon of Little Rock, it became a kind of wonderland for her. Suddenly, there was so much to acquire, taste, know. It marked the first time she had seen snow so deep, she went outside and lay down in it. The first time she had eaten meat cooked rare. The first place she'd felt popular. She thought no one knew anything about her connection to the Little Rock Nine, but that wasn't so, at least among the school's other blacks. It was almost a part of her name, one recalled. Elizabeth got involved with the theater group, working backstage in a production of Lillian Hellman's The Little Foxes, and even appearing in it briefly, as a maid. Gradually, though, she came to realize something quite fundamental. She missed black people. Sometimes she would wander nostalgically around Galesburg's small black neighborhood, drink at a local bar, and then, lest her house mother discover her slinking back after hours, spend the night in the ladies' room at the local train station. She grew disillusioned with the school when the fraternities and sororities would not admit her black friends. She had academic problems and lost her scholarship. Just around the time the NAACP magazine The Crisis reported that she was at Knox, it became clear that she would soon be leaving. She finished the year, then disappeared. A classmate heard from her only once after that, when she sent him a collection of famous poems that she had copied by hand. After writing "Deceased" on some literature the college sent her, she lost touch with Knox. In the fall of 1960, Elizabeth moved to Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, whose president Daisy Bates knew. This marked Elizabeth's first encounter with what she called hardcore northern ghetto blacks, and it was jarring. To her, they were predators, people who mocked her innocence and took advantage of her goodwill, the types to bum cigarettes off you when they already had their own. The small allowance Elizabeth got from her father, at Bates's insistence, covered only her laundry and her hair. For smokes, she ironed shirts for the other girls. On a couple of occasions, she again attempted suicide, but in different ways, by putting plastic laundry bags over her head, very inefficient, you breathe and breathe and breathe and nothing happens, or even more implausibly, by hitchhiking far from campus, half hoping that someone would pick her up and kill her. At this Central, as at the last, she endured for a year, hiding in the library, skipping classes. She left little trace of herself. A school photographer took her picture for the paper, but it couldn't be used. It was in profile, and her teeth protruded too hideously. Finally, her father fetched her. She returned to St. Louis, selling driving lessons, doing bookkeeping, working at a department store. She told herself she wanted to teach. Her grandfather considered that a woman's highest calling. But really, she was lost. Around this time, the United States Information Agency, seeking to counteract the images of church bombings and fire hoses coming out of the South, commissioned a film about Little Rock and its aftermath, a story it evidently deemed, at least in the sorry context of American race relations, to have had a happy ending. As the historian Melinda Schwenk has pointed out, it marked the first time the USIA focused on ordinary black people rather than on marquee names like Marian Anderson, Ralph Bunche, and Wilma Rudolph. Still, for the agency, then headed by Edward R. Murrow, making propaganda out of Little Rock was delicate. You had to concede the embarrassment of 1957, then pivot to the progress since, such as it was, but not too enthusiastically, lest you antagonize your segregationist congressional bankrollers. Easing the effort a bit was that by statute the film could be shown only abroad. The writer and director, Charles Guggenheim, had to hopscotch around all these landmines, plus others. He dared not disclose, for instance, that 4 of the 9 had married whites, nor could he fault Faubus, who was still governor. 9 from Little Rock, which was completed in 1964, actually focused on just 5 from Little Rock: Jefferson Thomas, Minnie Jean Brown, Thelma Mothershed, Ernest Green, and Elizabeth. They became proxies not just for the others, but for all of America's blacks. Elizabeth was probably included because she couldn't be excluded. It was she whom people would remember best and wonder about most. Apart from the familiar martial images from 1957, the film is upbeat, showing an integrated Central that had moved beyond its agony. So, too, it suggested, had its first blacks. "I haven't counted all the victories since that first day we all went to school here," an earnest Jefferson Thomas, shown walking around the school in a coat and tie — actually, the voice was a stand-in reading someone else's words — declares, "but I know there's been at least 9. Fitting Elizabeth's story into the inspiring superstructure required considerable legerdemain. As their own documents attest, the filmmakers were well aware of Elizabeth's problems, that she'd been sent home from Knox, where she seemed subject to fits of apathy, that at Central State, which they mistakenly called Wilberforce College, she had spent the first month of her second year watching television in her room. They picked up that at 3 o'clock one morning the police had found her wandering in a field 10 miles from campus with no idea how she'd gotten there, and that she had eventually dropped out, then failed to appear when she was supposed to have re-enrolled, telling school officials she'd become a domestic in Dayton. In fact, the documents noted, her present whereabouts were unknown. Guggenheim tracked Elizabeth down in St. Louis, but he told his viewers nothing about her setbacks. Instead, the film pretended both that she'd never been at Knox and that she had never left Central State. It depicted her as a typical co-ed, when in fact she had had to be brought back to the campus and given a handful of someone else's books. And there she is, checking a bulletin board for jobs, participating in a pep rally. Throughout, a voice purporting to be hers, it too belonged to an actor, read someone else's script. The world is a big place, and when I go out into it, I want to be sure I go out in the right direction, Elizabeth says, neglecting to mention that she was out there already, directionless. As unthreatening as Elizabeth was, Guggenheim apparently felt that he had to neuter her still more by criticizing her own people. No race, this Elizabeth points out, had a monopoly on prejudice. Some blacks also opposed integration, including at the historically black Central State. The Negro is like most Americans, possessing no monopoly on tolerance and hoping that the few, the uninformed, will not be confused with the rest of them, the ersatz Elizabeth concludes. Never one to make waves, the original Elizabeth went along with the ruses. She flew up to the campus, making a side trip to Southern Illinois University, where the segment on Minnie Jean was filmed. When she finally viewed the documentary at a private showing in St. Louis, she disliked what she saw. It really had nothing to do with her. Also, the woman reading her lines had a voice thinner than hers, didn't enunciate as clearly, and had more of a Southern accent. Given the slow pace of change at Central, the film's congratulatory tone seemed unwarranted, but its feel-good message surely helped it win an Academy Award for Best Documentary Short Subject. It was Elizabeth's last such venture for a time. When an Associated Press reporter attempted to speak with her in 1966, Bertie Eckford informed him that her daughter was too shy to be interviewed. Far more genuine than Guggenheim's film was another drama, also set in Little Rock, around the same time. Elizabeth, now 21, was visiting home in the summer of 1963 when she received a surprising phone call. It came from someone she'd never heard of before, a young woman named Hazel Bryan Massery.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Governor Deval Patrick, non-white male. Again, made an error. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. You should have caller to block number and our caller at 9325. Your lines should both be with us. Should have another half hour or so if you are interested in joining in the dialogue. Did folks have any comments off the second portion of the audio?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, first I'll say what I had left from the last one. I wanted to mention about the Thanksgiving dinner at Mrs. Bates' home. Can I be heard good?
I can hear you loud and clear. Yes, sir.
Okay. It said that the students were asked to explain why, in spite of everything, they preferred America to the Soviet Union. I thought that it was interesting that they would be asked a question when how could they give an educated explanation without having adequate knowledge about the Soviet Union? That's what I wanted to say before, but quickly, Dr. Kenneth Clark visited, and he did a final report on the students. There was a footnote associated with that. It seems that Dr. Clark had reservations about Melba Pattillo, suggesting that she was a publicity hound and that her mother had made a proposal that the black kids sell their stories. And that kind of verifies what I was thinking about those two in the first place. But some of the notes after that was Elizabeth seemed to be troubled, and she suffered from depression. The book mentioned that she felt sorry for one of the white students that was clearly from poverty. I thought that that was significant because usually when whites are talking about racism, they'll use conflation and then bring up the class and economics. But it seems funny that they don't mention it in this book when they're speaking about racism. The author doesn't bring out poverty and use that of the class as an excuse for the way that some of the whites were acting. Also thought it was interesting that they mentioned the Japanese internment camps. They were stationed all over America during that time. I know of some camps in Texas. And I want to bring up the fact that I wonder how many of the young Asians nowadays know about the difference in Angel Island as opposed to Ellis Island, where Ellis Island was used to process white people into the United States. It normally would only take up to 6 hours to process a white immigrant. But some of the immigrants at Angel Island spent years before they were processed in as citizens. I thought Elizabeth internalized a lot of her feelings. She didn't have anyone to talk to about what was happening to her. And it seems that she had lived a lifetime before she was even 21. Thanks for taking my call.
Did our other caller, did you have any thoughts you wanted to share?
Yeah, I just found it interesting how they kept at Central, how they kept all the black students separated in different classes, so they couldn't, interact with each other. I mean, with one another. And the only time I think they was able to, come together was at lunch. And when I read that, I thought about that book. I've never read it, but I've just heard about that book. Why do all the black kids, sit together at the lunch table? And white people they hate to see a group of black people, you know, they always think that we're plotting. They don't mind to see a bunch of, you know, Hispanics or Asians, you know, students or whatever, but they hate to see a bunch of black kids and black people, you know, together. And I always thought it was interesting that those white boys that I guess that were Elvis Presley worshipers, the one that wore their hair in ducktails and wore their cigarettes rolled up in their sleeves and stuff, they talked about them like they were just mischievous children, you know, they just was having fun, you know, by, you know, picking on the black students, and nobody took it serious. And also I want to say that I think it was also interesting that Elizabeth thought that when she went to the all-black school, she thought that only black people acted could be acting silly or ignorant, and she was surprised when she went to the white school when she saw the white kids acting like that, because I remember when I was a kid, there was a saying in the black community that black people used to say, act your age, not your color. And when she said that, you know, about she thought only black people acted like that, and I thought about that saying that black people used to say all the time. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, that I've heard that saying many times. I don't hear that sort of language applied to white people. Like when they were talking about, I was even thinking of Kenneth Clark, since white people cite his work with the doll study and saying, oh, segregation is so bad. It was in one of the NPR reports. They were saying segregation is so bad and it's a detriment. It's bad for black people. And I was like, well, is it bad for white people? Like if white people are at school with all white people, is it bad for them if they don't have contact with other black people? And if so, how? I just feel like that language of not getting to what's bad is racism, white supremacy. It's not a failure to have contact with white people or a failure to have contact with diversity, quote unquote, or other races, quote unquote. The problem is white supremacy, racism, white people terrorizing individuals they say are not white. That just stuck out to me quite a bit there. I guess one of the other about that book, and that's another one where they deflect, where all the attention goes to the victims. When I lived in California, since Joe from DC, who's visiting, I guess, California, when I was out there, it was this racist female, and she said, this is when I was very confused. She said, you know what book you should really read? Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together? And I was really confused at the time, but it just stuck with me that she would even suggest a book like that to me. And then I thought about it, and I was like, man, the book should be Why Are All the White People Sitting Together and living together and banking together and practicing racism together? Like, that's, you know, the people that are moving as a clique in a concentrated, coordinated effort. And even then, like, it stuck out to me. Like, I don't hear anybody talking, you know, wild about white people together. Even the few environments that I've been in where it's mostly non-white people, if it was a few white people, they would be together. I don't hear white people writing books and examining that phenomenon. So, yeah, that I had been thinking about maybe seeing if we could get the author of that book on the program just for the heck of it. Anyway, back to this book. Yeah, what did you all think of the section where, and he has this in quotes, Margolick, where, because they have been using the term hardcore. I remember Melba Patilla Beal, she used that term a lot too in Warriors Don't Cry. Hardcore segregationist. And that whole phrase has been said in this book too, but then she also uses the term hardcore. This is, I moved off the chapter. Not to
talking about black people?
Yes.
Hardcore ghetto people?
Yes, this is in chapter 22, she says that she had never been around northern black people. She says, in the fall of 1960, Elizabeth moved to Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio, whose president Daisy Bates knew. This marked Elizabeth's first encounter with what she called hardcore northern ghetto blacks, and it was jarring to her. They were predators. People who mocked her innocence and took advantage of her goodwill. The types to bum cigarettes off you when they already had their own. What did you all think of that paragraph? Well, yeah, what did you all think of that paragraph? The only part that's in quotes is hardcore northern ghetto blacks.
I wonder if she actually said that herself or if that's just his words.
I can actually see Elizabeth moving towards that type because she was not actually seeing things realistically. You know, feeling sorry for the white students when, you know, they're terrorizing you. You know, mentioning the few incidents where they would be nice to you. You know, it's the common thing, the anti-blackness. That's the beginning of the anti-blackness, talking about the northern ghetto blacks. And when she should have had all types of negative things to say about these white people that's making your life miserable. They had her in a mental illness state to where she was totally depressed and she had nothing, seemed like nothing to live for at this point.
Yeah, I could see her moving towards that, those type of quote-unquote black people too, because she started, after she moved, I think it was to St. Louis or one of those places, she got tired of I think they said she got tired of being around white people, and she started seeking out black people. This was before she got that far north. But she started seeking out black people. And so, I mean, I used to hear some black people say that those kind of black people keep it real. You know, like you can't be real unless you're calling each other nigga or, you know, and you know, acting the way, the stereotypical way the white folks say we should act. And so by her, you know, seeking, you know, wanting to, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with her wanting to seek out black people, but the fact that she was in a confused state and she was so depressed and everything, I could see her, you know, going that route and, you know, and getting involved, you know, with people like that so-called, quote-unquote, keep it real, you know. But that's just my take on it. I may be wrong.
Just the fact that the term hardcore was associated with racists, hardcore segregationists, and hardcore ghetto blacks. What it lists here that was so or the only thing that's listed here about these predators reminded me of the movie with the alien with the dreadlocks. That the only mistreatment that they listed was bumming cigarettes. Now, to me, that goes back to what we talked about on Wednesday, talking about these accusations of wrongdoing against black politicians. The scale is just, it is astronomical. It's like comparing a teaspoon of water to the Pacific Ocean in talking about incorrect things black people, victims of racism, are able to do under these conditions, and incorrect things that white people are able to do. Now, if the hardcore ghetto blacks, their predatory behavior is bumming cigarettes. Now, compare that to the behavior of the hardcore segregationist whites who are organizing all sorts of campaigns, closing schools. I mean, they are costing people jobs, and the hardcore black people are bumming cigarettes.
Now, the hardcore segregationists that they're talking about in the book, are those supposed to be black people or white people?
I have got the impression thus far that all of the hardcore segregationists have been white people.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
I could be wrong there. If anybody has felt that the term segregationist has been used to reference a non-white person, you could let us know. I would appreciate that. But I think that's only been applied to white people so far.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and concerning Kenneth Clark and the doll experiment, white people always, at least nowadays, they always try to act like, that's our fault, that our children are like that, because they had a great big old special about that on CNN. I didn't even want to watch it, but with Anderson Cooper and whatever, and they trying to act like that's because black people, we don't teach our children about racial pride or stuff like that. I mean, it was like a blame thing to me. That's the way I always took that.
Yeah, it's pretty standard in my opinion with regards to finding a way to blame the victim or say it's some failure on I'm sure that's going to come up in this book as well as we continue to read means of blaming the victim for the.
Oh yeah, you're gonna see he's gonna really make Hazel the victim, like poor Hazel.
Yeah,
she didn't know what she was doing. She was confused. She didn't know any better.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. As I said, your brain computer really should be on with this book since a white person wrote it. Has it impacted your listening experience, the fact that the reader is a white woman, but the author is a white man? Has that impacted?
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Has that impacted? Yes. How has that impacted the listening experience?
She's a Southern white woman too. You can tell by the accent, unless she's just, affecting that.
Well, I had mentioned before also that I didn't think she put emphasis where it needed to be put, and she doesn't go into those, different types of, like she's imitating the person who's speaking.
Yeah, that's not nice.
Yeah, that's okay, but the fact that she really doesn't emphasize the things that need emphasizing, especially when it has to do negatively with white people.
Yeah, it seems like she kind of downplays it, or she kind of minimize it, like it's trite, nothing really worth, considering.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And like Gus was pointing out, the synchronization and the collaboration, everything seems to, just flow along. It's just amazing how, they can be doing the same thing in totally different areas all over the United States and even all over the world. And the same thing is happening in a similar manner. It's just astonishing.
That is the world in which we live. I'm reminded of the program. Folks can visit the archives when we had two non-white parents on the broadcast in October of 2011. They were joining us from Switzerland, and their black child was in school, and they kept playing the game, Who's Afraid of the Black Man? They had asked them to stop playing the game, and they kept doing it and terrorizing their child, worldwide. Same behavior. This is 2011 that this was going on, so same behavior worldwide. Just what does it mean to be a white person? This is to be expected under racist education systems worldwide. I didn't want to leave out. We have about 10 minutes, a little more than 10 minutes left in the program. So if folks are listening in and if you have any comments you want to give it in before we wrap up, now would be the time to do so. I did also wanted to make sure I didn't minimize Governor Faubus when he's giving his interview. I think this might have even been during the first audio segment where he blames Elizabeth Eckford and saying that this was some sinister Negro plot where they tried to find the most hapless-looking Negro possible to send her out so that everybody would feel bad for her being jeered and picking on this lowly darky. I thought that was incredible. That uncouth, stupid black people have staged with, military precision this elaborate scheme so that they can get these photos all over the world to make white people of Arkansas look bad. That is astounding. Governor Faubus.
Yeah, that's that too.
I think this whole thing was probably the only thing of significance in history that he ever accomplished. Because when you read about him, it's hardly anything else that they have to say about the guy. I mean, his term as governor, what did he really accomplish? Besides trying to maintain the system of white supremacy.
I just wanted to recommend a book. I know I talked about it last week. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. I don't know if you checked it out, by a black female.
I ordered that book.
Huh?
I have that book now. I ordered it because I heard you talk about it.
Yeah. I think that would be an interest. Have you got it yet?
Yeah, I have it. I just received it today.
That book is really, really interesting because, for years I used to wonder how were the black people able to get out of the South? And every time I would ask older black people, they would just tell me, "Oh, they just left." But I was like, "But who was going to pick that cotton? And how would the white people be able to, keep getting that money from, the tenant farmers that they were picking that cotton?" I mean, I would think that the white people would try to keep them, from leaving. And it was in reading that book that I finally found out that most of them had to sneak off, or they had to lie, or something to get out. Because I just could not believe that white people would just allow them. I mean, like thousands and thousands of black people left the South between the First and the Second World War. I think all the way up into the early 1970s, I think, or 1960s. I'm not sure, but yeah. But that book answered a lot of questions for me and stuff. But that's a really good book.
Got it on my wish list. Check it out. I put it on there after you mentioned it last week. If anybody, I have it on my wish list, but I would prefer the audiobook. Although I do have the paperback on my wish list, I would prefer the audiobook. But yeah, I made an effort to check that out when you mentioned it last week. Getting on this book before we wrap up. Anybody who's on that last topic, I would check out Douglas Blackmon's Slavery by Another Name. Also, Texas Tough by Robert Perkinson. These are both white authors. They've both been on the program where they talked about how white people put rules in place so that black people couldn't just leave. And had a whole elaborate code around that. They were not just going to allow their cotton-picking niggers to leave freely. They made a lot of rules to make that difficult, if you're interested in reading more on that.
Yeah, I have Slavery by Another Name. I read that a few years ago whenever it came out. That is a really, really riveting, interesting book, but I have not heard of Texas Tough.
It's pretty good. It's on those same lines. He references Douglas Blackmon's book, and he has some of the same photographs. It's kind of the same book, but set in Texas as opposed to Georgia. Okay. It's a little bit newer.
On the DVD, Slavery by Another Name, Eric Holder's wife.
Yeah, she's in that.
Is on that DVD.
It's just some of her family members was caught up in that.
One of her family members was part of that. I thought that was interesting. But also, when these students were able to leave Little Rock and go and live with other families and go to other parts of the United States, I find it amazing that they would even come back, really. I mean, personally, I grew up in the South, and the first chance I got to get out of there, I was gone. I came back shortly, but the first thing smoking, I was out of there again. You can't, it's an old saying, you can never go home. And it seems like the ones that didn't go back, went on to do very well. And I think that may have been detrimental to Elizabeth when she went back.
Do you really think the South is that? I mean, I've never been down South, but do you really think is it really that much worse than living in the North? I mean,
well, actually, they're straight up with the racism, and you know exactly where they're coming from. It's just that it's the same thing everywhere. It's just that it's more refined and hidden in other places, and you can have some resemblance of a normal life, but it still eludes you. But I mean, some of the blatant races and the things that you endure in the South, you have to become accustomed to that in order to live in that, that type of environment.
Yeah, because I used to work with a lot of people from Mississippi, and I would talk to them, and I would ask them, I said, how was it like living in Mississippi, because I heard all these negative things, and they said, oh, it was fine. The white people, they didn't bother us as long as we stayed in our place. And, they're like, it was just, wonderful and everything. And, everything was fine. But I did talk to this one sister, and she was real. She told me about, she said, they're so mean down there. She said, I remember we used to have to jump in the ditch when they used to come driving down the street because they used to try to run us down. And I said, well, I'm from Southern Illinois, and the same thing happened to us. White people used to come to our community, and we'd have to jump in the ditches and stuff to keep them from running us down.
Wow. We have about 3 minutes left in the program. We will be back with the compensatory call-in tomorrow. Will be cool to catch up news reports, all of the racist activity associated with the bombing in Boston, as well as other news events past 7 days. Been an interesting week on the plantation. I guess quickly, what did you all think of the statement from Kenneth Clark? This is, I think, during the first, I'm not sure, first or second, I'm thinking first audio segment today when he was doing his evaluation. He was saying that the students, they were having such a good time, and he found them in surprisingly good shape. Centuries of oppression, he theorized, had endowed them with ample survival skills. What did you all think about that sentence before we wrap up?
I actually wondered if Kenneth Clark was a black man when he made that statement. I mean, I found it, I thought it was something that a racist would say. Really?
Me too. The same thing I was thinking. Yeah.
Why would that statement strike you as something that a racist would say?
Because how could centuries of oppression give you ample survival skills when black people today, we don't know any more about how to deal with racism than what we did 100 years ago.
That's right, because it keeps changing.
Yeah. Centuries ago, we were even worse. I mean, I don't see any survival skill. I know one survival skill we've obtained, and that's perseverance. We can almost take anything, and we're still here. But that's about all I could say about it.
Maybe
it's
that's
like the one guy.
Amen. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the one guy was saying, what are some of the good things that black people have or whatever? And I thought about that question. And besides persevering and the fact that we can adapt to any type of situation, I can't think of much more to even say. But that's not saying too much, because you can see some of the worst conditions and we will adapt to them. I mean, what is that saying?
Yeah, that statement was probably going to appear in Ebony magazine, and that was, that was kind of one of those quote unquote Negro publications. And I mean, he probably said that, to pacify whites, and that's what I'm thinking. That's one thing. Like, I mean, without knowing the kind of person he was or is, it's hard for me, to judge how and why he made that statement.
Well, he put his money where his mouth was, because he allowed one of the students to live with him, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. Yeah, that statement. I'm glad people were able to share on that before we wrap the program up. When I heard it, it stunned me for a lot of the reasons that you all mentioned. But then I said, well, wait a minute, I can't act like I haven't heard that before. Like, it would be disingenuous of me to act like I haven't heard 50, 100 different black people say that, and then like a whole chorus of black people behind them. Amen, right on, brother, that's right. And it was just like, that is just goofy. Like, to make it, I mean, who would say centuries of terrorism has made us stronger and given us wonderful abilities to adapt and survive? I mean, who would say that? I mean,
but have you ever read the book Invisible Man?
Oh, I love it. We've done 2 programs on it. It's one of my favorite books.
Oh, okay, because there is a black professor in that book, and he kind of talks the same way. When in the first part of the book, when the guy is going to the all-black school in the South, I think there's a black professor that says something similar to that, and he also says, our people are much better looking than they used to be, and something about how we're I'm sorry, I'm just paraphrasing, something about how we're, smarter now because of all that we've had to go through or something. It's been a long time since I read that book, so I can't remember exactly, but that phrase kind of reminds me of that professor, an invisible man.
Yeah, I would tell anybody, if you're familiar with that book, I'm forgetting the good doctor's name, which it's been a while since I've read it too. I've read it many times. It's just been a while since the last time.
I have too. I read it a lot of times too.
But I would say, matter of fact, if you read the book, you'll get a better understanding of that character. That says a lot. The fact that character is the person in the book who made such a statement, and so early in the book, that is significant to me. At any rate, we've done our 3 hours. We'll be back for the call-in tomorrow, which should be a hoot. We'll be looking forward to that. Had a guest, one of our listeners, emailed me from, got to check my email. I got behind again. I'll check my email and catch up as soon as possible. Tune in next week. Looking forward to it. We're at the halfway point. If you have books that you think we should do next, and it could be 2. If you all think this book has been whack and a waste of time, you can make that known, and then you all can pick 2. If not, you all will be at least picking 1. So think of the next book. We have 3 study sessions left on Elizabeth and Hazel, and then we will be moving on to the next book. Tune in tomorrow. Compensatory call-in. Thank you for checking out the broadcast. Hope it was constructive investment of your currency, time, and energy. Check out Justice's blog, justdojusticetoday.blogspot.com. Anybody want to do the prayer to wrap things up?
I'll take a shot at it.
Right on. We'll be back tomorrow, and thanks again. Our caller that is about to do the prayer, he invested and got a plug I had on my wish list, a plug for my MacBook computer because I knew the one that I had, it was on its last leg, and he sent me the plug some weeks ago. My plug finally died this week, and bang, had my backup ready to roll per our investor. Thank you all again for helping to keep the program on the air. Take it away, caller.
Creator, we ask you to endow us with knowledge, strength, wisdom, that we may be able to solve the greatest problem that is plaguing the planet. That's the system of white supremacy. We thank you in advance that we are making inroads towards solving this problem. And we pray that we go out, our voices go out and share the knowledge, and will bring others into the light and help us as we pursue the answer to this problem. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thank you all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
Even my conditioning has been conditioned.